What if I told you that one moment of pride was enough to turn the gods against a hero? A single decision condemned him to 20 years of relentless suffering. He would battle monstrous creatures, outwit deadly temptations, survive impossible storms, and face enemies no ordinary man could ever hope to defeat. Yet his greatest challenge was never winning a war, it was finding his way home. But what did he do to earn the wrath of the gods? Why did every man who sailed with him perish, while only he survived? And what unimaginable trials awaited him across the sea? Before we uncover the answers, take a moment to subscribe. It takes less than 2 seconds, but your support makes it possible to spend countless hours researching, writing, and creating documentaries like this. Now, let the journey begin. Close your eyes, if you wish, and let your mind drift backward across time, past everything you have ever known, past the memory of nations rising and falling, back more than 3,000 years, to a world lit only by fire and starlight, where kings ruled from stone palaces perched above the sea, and where men believed, without question, that the gods themselves walked the clouds above Mount Olympus, watching, judging, and reaching down, when the mood took them, to touch the lives of mortals far below. This was Greece in its Bronze Age, though the people who lived there had no name yet for the age they inhabited. It was a land shaped by stone and light, its mountains falling away sharply into water so blue it seemed almost unreal, its valleys pinched narrow between ridges so steep that a man might live his entire life without once seeing what lay beyond the next hill. Because the land divided itself this way, the people divided too, gathering not into one great nation but into many small kingdoms, each with its own king, its own warriors, its own pride, and its own stubborn belief that its way of doing things was the correct way. Consider what it meant, in such a world, to be remembered at all. There was no promise, in the belief of these people, of a joyous afterlife awaiting the virtuous dead. The underworld the Greeks imagined was a gray and joyless place, where the shades of the departed drifted without purpose or pleasure, stripped of the vigor and passion that had defined them in life. Facing so bleak a picture of what came after death, the Greeks of this age fixed their hopes instead upon a different kind of immortality, one achieved not in some future paradise, but in the living memory of those left behind, in the songs that would carry a man's name forward long after his body had returned to the earth. In these kingdoms, then, a man's worth was measured by 2 things above all else: honor and glory. To die bravely, defending one's home or one's companions, was considered a finer thing than to grow old quietly and be forgotten. A king in this world was not a distant figure hidden behind palace walls. He fought at the front of his men rather than behind them. He welcomed strangers into his home with food and wine and shelter, because hospitality was sacred, a debt owed not only to the traveler, but to the gods who were believed to watch, disguised, over every stranger who knocked upon a door. He judged disputes fairly, or was expected to, and he understood, in his bones, that his kingdom could be lost as easily as it had been won. Picture, for a moment, the texture of daily life in one of these small kingdoms. In the Megaron, the great central hall of any respectable palace, a fire burned constantly at the heart of the room, its smoke curling upward through an opening in the roof, while around its edges nobles and servants moved between duties, mending bronze-tipped spears, weaving fine wool into cloaks dyed the deep purple that only the wealthiest could afford, or grinding grain for the next meal. Outside, in the surrounding countryside, farmers coaxed barley and olives from stony soil, herded goats along terraced hillsides, and pressed grapes into the wine that would be poured, mixed generously with water, at every feast and every sacrifice. Clothing was simple but carefully made, tunics of linen or wool belted at the waist, cloaks pinned with bronze brooches, sandals of leather for those who could afford them, bare feet for those who could not. Armor, when it was needed, gleamed of bronze rather than iron, heavy and beautifully wrought. A warrior's helmet often crowned with a crest of horsehair, meant to make him appear taller and more terrible to his enemies. And always, somewhere near at hand, there stood a small altar or shrine, for no meal was eaten, no journey begun, no important decision made, without first pouring out a portion of wine or burning a portion of meat in offering to the gods who were believed to be watching. And always, at the edge of everything, there was the sea. It fed these people, carried their ships from one small kingdom to the next, brought them bronze and tin and dye from distant shores they would never see with their own eyes. But the sea was never simply a road. It was alive, in the way the Greeks understood such things, moody and vast, and utterly indifferent to the plans of mortal men, ruled by a god whose temper could calm its surface to glass in 1 hour and tear it into mountains of foam in the next. To sail was to place your life, quite literally, into the hands of the divine, and every sailor who ever left a Greek harbor understood this, whether he spoke it aloud or not. It was from within this world of proud kings and sacred guest-right and restless, godlike water that the greatest story ever carried down through the memory of an entire civilization was born. We do not know, with any real certainty, who first gave that story its final shape. Tradition offers us a name. Homer, a blind poet said to have wandered from town to town, holding within his memory an entire universe of gods and heroes, reciting verses that may have been shaped and reshaped by countless singers before him. Whether Homer was one man or many voices gathered beneath a single legendary name, we cannot say for certain. What we do know is that somewhere near 28 centuries ago, the poem we now call the Odyssey took on the form that has reached us today, carried first by voice, then by ink, then by every language and generation that followed. Why has this particular story outlived so many others that time has swallowed whole? Perhaps because, beneath its gods and monsters, it is a deeply human story. It is the story of a man trying to get home. It is the story of a wife waiting, faithfully and painfully, without knowing whether her husband is alive or dead. It is the story of a son growing into manhood in his father's absence, uncertain of who he is meant to become. These are not, in the end, the concerns of gods. They are the concerns of anyone who has ever loved someone and been separated from them by war, or distance, or time, or simple, unfair chance. And it is to understand this man, and the war that first took him from his home, that our story now turns. Long before the events we have gathered to hear tonight, the greatest war the Greek world had ever known was fought beneath the high walls of a city called Troy, on the coast of what is now Turkey. The causes of that war were tangled in both mortal pride and divine mischief, but at the center of it all stood a woman named Helen, wife to a Greek king named Menelaus, said to be the most beautiful woman who had ever lived. When a Trojan prince named Paris took Helen from her husband's house and carried her back across the sea to Troy, the insult struck at something sacred, the bond of hospitality itself, and the honor of every Greek king who had once sworn an oath to defend her marriage, whoever her husband turned out to be. And so the kings of Greece gathered their ships and their soldiers and sailed for Troy to bring her home, or die trying. Among them was Menelaus, the wronged husband. Among them was his brother Agamemnon, the most powerful king in Greece, who led the combined army. And among them, too, walked heroes whose names would outlive the war itself. Chief among them Achilles, a warrior so swift and so terrible in combat that men on both sides were said to tremble simply at the sound of his name. And on the Trojan side, Hector, prince of the city, a man whose courage matched Achilles' own, but whose heart beat for a different reason entirely. For Hector did not fight for glory, but for the plain, desperate duty of protecting his wife, his infant son, and the walls that stood between his people and ruin. For 10 long years the war ground on beneath those walls, neither side able to claim the final victory. The plain outside the city soaked again and again with the blood of men who had sailed from 100 different shores. The Greek camp, in those years, became almost a city of its own, a sprawl of ships drawn up upon the sand, their black hulls resting side by side for what seemed an impossible distance, and beyond them tents and huts where thousands of men waited, season after season, for a war that refused to end. Each morning brought the same terrible rhythm, the clash of bronze against bronze beneath the walls, the cries of wounded men carried back to camp, the funeral fires lit at dusk for those who would not see another dawn. Achilles, in his fury and his pride, quarreled bitterly with Agamemnon over the spoils of war and withdrew from the fighting entirely for a long stretch of that final year, a withdrawal that nearly cost the Greeks everything, until the death of his dearest companion at Hector's hand drove him back into battle with a wrath so terrible that even his own allies were said to fear. him nearly as much as the Trojans did. We will not linger long over the details of that war here, for it is a tale unto itself, and not the one we have come tonight to tell. It is enough to know that Troy did not fall to strength of arms alone, but to a trick of extraordinary cunning. A massive wooden horse, built by the Greeks and left outside the gates as though it were an offering, a symbol of surrender and retreat. Hidden within its hollow belly were armed soldiers, waiting silently in the dark. The Trojans, believing their long war finally won, dragged the horse inside their own walls as a trophy, and that night, while the city slept off its celebration, the hidden men climbed down and threw open the gates to the army waiting beyond. By morning, the city that had endured 10 years of siege had fallen in a single night, swallowed by fire and grief. The man who devised that final, decisive trick was not Achilles, who had already fallen before the war's end, nor any of the towering warrior kings whose names filled the songs of open battle. He was the ruler of a small and rocky kingdom, a man known less for the strength of his arm than for the extraordinary sharpness of his mind. His name was Odysseus, king of an island called Ithaca, and it is here, at the very moment of Troy's fall, at the very moment when every other Greek king began loading his ships for the voyage home, that our true story begins. For most Greek heroes, the war was over. But for one man, the greatest journey had only just begun. To understand this man, we must understand what he was sailing away from, and what he was so desperate to return to. Ithaca was no grand kingdom of golden riches or vast armies. It was a small, rocky island in the western sea, a place of steep hillsides, wild goats, and modest farms, more beautiful in its rugged simplicity than in any display of wealth. But it possessed something rarer than gold, a king whose reputation for intelligence had traveled far beyond its shores, so that even among the great warrior lords of Greece, men spoke of Odysseus with a particular kind of respect, the respect reserved for someone whose truest weapon was not the spear in his hand but the mind behind his eyes. He was not the strongest man who sailed to Troy, nor the swiftest in a foot race, nor the most fearsome in single combat. But in council, when kings argued strategy long into the night, it was so often his voice that found the solution no one else in the tent had considered. He possessed the rare gift of seeing several moves ahead, of understanding not only what an enemy might do, but what an enemy believed his opponent would do, and then choosing to act differently still. This particular gift, this resourceful, adaptable cunning that the old poets praised in every verse concerning him, was its own form of heroism, every bit as worthy of song as strength of arms, and it would prove, before our story is finished, to be the very quality that carried him through trials no ordinary man could have survived. But before the war, before the 10 years of siege and the 10 years of wandering that would follow it, Odysseus had been, first and simply, a husband and a new father. His wife was Penelope, a woman prized not merely for her beauty, but for a keenness of mind that matched her husband's own, a rare and genuine partnership in an age when marriages were so often arranged for advantage alone. When word came that the kings of Greece were gathering their ships to sail against Troy, it is said that Odysseus, unwilling to abandon his young wife and newborn son, even attempted to feign madness to escape the summons, yoking a donkey and an ox together to plow a field and sowing it with salt instead of seed, hoping to be judged unfit for war. But the ruse was uncovered when a visiting nobleman placed the infant Telemachus directly in the path of the plow, and Odysseus, unable to bring himself to harm his own son, swerved the blade aside, proving his sanity beyond doubt. Honor left him no further escape. He sailed for Troy, leaving behind a wife who did not yet know how long the parting would stretch, and a son too young to ever remember his father's face. It is worth pausing here, before the story rushes forward, to feel the full weight of that departure. Odysseus did not know, as he watched the shores of Ithaca shrink behind his ship, that he would not see his home again for 20 years. He did not know that his infant son would grow into a young man he would not recognize, or that 10 years of war would be followed by 10 more of storm and loss before he finally set foot again on his own soil. Already, in this single moment of leaving, we can see the shape of everything still to come, a man torn from all that he loves, carried farther and farther from the place where his heart truly remains. Throughout the years that followed, It is said he never once stopped longing for home. Other heroes at Troy fought for glory, for the promise that their names would outlive them. Odysseus fought, and later endured, for something smaller and yet somehow larger still. The simple hope of walking once more through his own halls, of holding his wife again, of learning what kind of man his son had become in his absence. The Greeks had a word for this particular ache, nostos, the pain and longing of the journey home. And it is from this very word that we inherit our own modern word, nostalgia. The whole of the story you are about to hear is, in its deepest sense, a long meditation on that ache. No telling of this story can go far, however, without some understanding of the gods who watched over, and so often meddled in, the lives of the mortals below them. For the Greeks, the divine was never distant or abstract. Their gods were vivid, quarrelsome, and startlingly human in temperament, prone to jealousy and favoritism and sudden anger, only wrapped in powers no mortal could hope to match. They were believed to feast eternally atop Mount Olympus, watching the affairs of men as one might watch a particularly absorbing drama unfold below, and reaching down, whenever it pleased them, to bend the story to their liking. At the head of this divine family sat Zeus, king of the gods, ruler of sky and thunder, whose word, once spoken, even other gods hesitated to unmake. Among his children was a goddess who matters more to our story than perhaps any other, Athena, goddess of wisdom and clever strategy, said to have sprung fully grown and armored from her father's own skull, a fitting birth for a goddess whose gift was the sharp, strategic mind that wins wars through cunning rather than brute strength alone. It is little wonder that Athena felt a particular fondness for Odysseus, a mortal whose mind worked so very much like her own, and throughout the whole of his ordeal, it would be she, sometimes in her own form, sometimes disguised as a mortal stranger or an old friend, who worked tirelessly to guide him home and steady those he loved in his absence. But Odysseus did not enjoy the favor of every god who mattered. Ranged against him stood Poseidon, brother to Zeus, ruler of every wave and current and storm across the known world, and his hatred for Odysseus was no small or petty grievance. It was a debt of vengeance, owed for an injury done to a son Poseidon loved dearly, a monstrous being whose path would cross our hero's own before this story is finished. Because Poseidon ruled the sea entirely, and because the sea alone could carry Odysseus home, this divine fury meant that the whole of his long journey would be fought, quite literally, against the will of the very god who commanded the water beneath his ship. Here, then, is the tension that shapes everything to come. A mortal of extraordinary cleverness, favored by the goddess of wisdom, cursed by the lord of the sea, caught between these two towering powers as he tries, again and again, simply to find his way home. While Odysseus fought at Troy, and while he later wandered lost upon waters no chart could describe, life on Ithaca did not simply pause and wait for him. It grew quieter instead, and harder, and slowly, painfully, more dangerous still, for a kingdom without its king is like a body without its heart, still breathing, still moving, but increasingly at risk of falling into ruin. At the center of that slow unraveling stood Penelope, a woman whose entire adult life had come to be defined by waiting. In the early years after her husband sailed for Troy, her waiting had a shape and a horizon to it, for surely the war would end and the ships would return. But when the war ended and Odysseus did not come home with the other kings, when year followed year without word of where he was or whether he lived at all, her waiting became something far heavier, a suspended existence, neither wife nor widow, unable to grieve fully because she could not be certain there was anything yet to grieve, and unable to hope fully because hope stretched too thin for too long becomes its own kind of exhaustion. Imagine those years as she must have lived them, looking each morning toward the harbor, half expecting even after 2 decades to glimpse a familiar sail on the horizon, retiring each evening to a bed grown cold with solitude, in a home increasingly crowded with strangers who did not honor her grief, precisely because they had long since decided her husband would never return to defend his own house. Beside her, growing up inside this uncertainty, was her son Telemachus, an infant when his father sailed away, too young to hold even a single memory of the man's face or voice. Everything he knew of Odysseus came to him secondhand, through his mother's careful stories, through old servants who remembered the young king before the war, through the songs of wandering poets who still sang of the cleverness that had helped bring down the walls of Troy. He grew into boyhood, and then toward the edge of manhood, essentially fatherless, carrying a grief he had inherited rather than earned, and a responsibility that grew heavier with every passing year, for as the son of the king, the throne of Ithaca belonged rightfully to him, waiting only until he was old enough and strong enough to claim it. By the time our story properly opens, some 20 years after Odysseus first sailed away, the kingdom of Ithaca had grown badly diseased with a particular kind of trouble. Word had spread across the island and its neighbors that the king had been absent so long, through war and years of unbroken silence, that he must surely be dead, and where a queen is believed a widow and a throne believed empty, ambitious men will always come circling, the way gulls are drawn to a wounded ship. They arrived calling themselves suitors, young noblemen from Ithaca and the surrounding islands, each hoping to win Penelope's hand and, with it, the wealth and throne of the kingdom itself. Perhaps a handful, in the beginning, came with something resembling honest intention. But as months stretched into years, and Penelope neither accepted nor firmly refused anyone among them, clinging instead to the fragile hope that her husband might yet return, their patience curdled into something far uglier. By the time our story begins, more than 100 of these men had installed themselves, uninvited, inside the very palace of Ithaca, with no intention of leaving until one of them had claimed what he had come for. Picture that hall as it had become, where once a modest, orderly household went about its business beneath the steady rule of a respected king. Now it more closely resembled a long and unending occupation. Day after day, the suitors filled the great room with feasting, slaughtering Odysseus's own cattle and sheep for their meals, emptying his stores of wine, sprawling across furniture that was never theirs, treating the palace as an inheritance already secured. The great hall that had once smelled of cedar smoke and clean-woven wool now reeked, most evenings, of spilled wine and roasting meat consumed without restraint, the floor littered with bones tossed carelessly aside, the once orderly stores of the household steadily emptied by appetites that showed no sign of slowing. Servants who had faithfully kept the house in Odysseus's absence now found themselves run ragged fetching wine and turning spits from dawn until deep into the night. Some of them, it is said, even pressured or bribed into a loyalty toward the suitors that betrayed the household they were meant to serve. Worse than their gluttony was their disrespect. These were men who, under the old law of hospitality so sacred to the Greeks, ought to have conducted themselves as guests owing courtesy to their host. Instead, they had become something nearer to invaders, contemptuous of the household that fed them, dismissive of the young Telemachus who technically ruled that house, and increasingly aggressive in their demand that Penelope simply choose a husband among them and be done with the matter, so that the contest might end and one of them might finally claim the prize. Penelope met this pressure with a cleverness that, in its quiet way, matched her absent husband's own famous cunning. She announced that she would choose among the suitors only once she had finished weaving a burial shroud for her aging father-in-law Laertes, as custom and piety required of her. Each day, before the suitor's watching eyes, she wove patiently at her loom, appearing to make slow progress on the great cloth. Each night, in secret, she unraveled by torchlight everything her hands had woven since morning, ensuring the shroud would never near completion, buying herself month after month, and eventually year after year, of precious delay. For 3 full years this quiet resistance succeeded, proof that she was every bit as capable of resourceful deception as her husband, though her weapon was a loom rather than a wooden horse. But such secrets rarely last forever, and eventually a servant betrayed her, and Penelope found herself facing the suitor's demands with no clever trick left to offer, only a thinning hope that Odysseus, against every reasonable expectation, might somehow still find his way home before her choice could be delayed no longer. If Penelope's suffering was the suffering of uncertain waiting, her son's suffering carried a different, though related, weight, the particular ache of growing into manhood beneath the shadow of an absence he could never fully understand. By now Telemachus stood at the very threshold of adulthood, no longer a child, not yet fully a man, uncertain of his own authority inside a household that had long since stopped taking him seriously. Imagine what it must feel like to be the rightful heir to a throne and yet watch, day after day, as more than 100 grown men occupy your own home, devour your own cattle, and treat you as little more than an irritating boy rather than the young lord you technically are. Telemachus had grown up without a father to model courage for him, without guidance to teach him how a king asserts authority or how a man commands respect in a room inclined to dismiss him. And so he carried within himself a quiet, simmering frustration, equal parts fear and helpless anger that had, until now, found no outlet at all. He feared his father truly was dead, and felt disloyal even for entertaining the thought. He feared, too, that were Odysseus somehow still alive, the young man waiting for him at home would prove a disappointment, untested and unable to protect his own mother or household in his father's absence. And beneath these fears lay a fragile, half-suppressed hope that somewhere on some distant shore his father still fought his way homeward, and that one day, before it was too late, Telemachus might finally look into the face of the man he had spent his whole life imagining. It was at this fragile moment, hope and despair so evenly balanced within him, that the goddess Athena chose to intervene. She did not appear in her full divine glory, in a blaze of light that might have overwhelmed him. She came instead disguised as a stranger, an old family friend named Mintes, a traveling nobleman with a kind, weathered face and the easy bearing of someone who had seen much of the world. Approaching the palace, she found Telemachus seated among the feasting suitors, his posture withdrawn, his eyes carrying the particular weariness of a young man forced night after night to watch strangers consume his own inheritance. Seeing this visitor arrive at the gate, Telemachus, ever mindful of the sacred duties of hospitality even in a household that had long forgotten them, rose at once to welcome him properly, embarrassed that a guest should witness the suitor's rude and chaotic feast. "Forgive the noise of this hall," Telemachus said, guiding the stranger to a seat apart from the others. "It was not always so disordered here. My father, were he home, would never have allowed such men to feast upon another man's cattle without shame." "And where is your father now?" the disguised goddess asked, watching him carefully. Telemachus's face darkened. "Gone. Sailed for Troy when I was still at my mother's breast, and never returned, though the war ended long ago. Some say he is dead. My mother will not believe it, though I confess there are nights I no longer know what to believe myself." It was in the quiet conversation that followed, away from the noise of the hall, that Athena, still wearing the shape of Mintes, spoke to him not as a condescending elder addressing a helpless boy, but as one who saw in him something he had not yet learned to see in himself, the seed of the very courage and cleverness that had made his father famous. "You are wrong to despair so easily," she told him. "Your father is not dead. He is held somewhere far from here, against his will, upon an island surrounded by endless sea, kept from returning by powers greater than himself. But you are no longer a child, Telemachus, and the time has come to stop sitting quietly amid your own grief. Call the men of this island to assembly. Tell these suitors, before all of Ithaca, exactly what you think of their conduct, and then take a ship and sail to Pylos and to Sparta, and ask the men who fought beside your father whether they know anything of his fate. A son who searches for his father is already, in the searching, becoming the man that father would wish to find waiting for him." There was a purpose in this counsel deeper than the simple gathering of facts. It was, in truth, a rite of passage, a journey meant to carry Telemachus from a passive, uncertain boy into a young man capable of facing danger, addressing kings, and one day standing beside his father as something nearer to an equal. And Telemachus, stirred by something within himself he had not felt in years, call it hope or purpose or the first true stirrings of manhood, resolved to do exactly as the stranger advised. The following morning, before the assembled men of Ithaca, Telemachus stood and spoke as a king's son ought to speak, denouncing the suitors' shameless conduct in front of the entire community, his voice unsteady at first but growing firmer as he continued. The suitors, accustomed to his silence, mocked him openly, one among them rising to sneer that the boy had grown suddenly bold for someone who commanded no army and held no real power. But the act itself marked a genuine turning point. Telemachus had found his voice, and having found it, He prepared in secret to slip away from Ithaca under cover of darkness, setting sail toward the palace of an old and honored friend of his father's, in search of the truth about the man he barely remembered but had never once stopped wishing to know. He told no one of his plans save a handful of trusted companions and the old nurse who had cared for him since infancy, swearing her to silence lest word reach his mother too soon and cause her needless grief, or worse, reach the suitors, who would surely have tried to stop him, fearing that a grown and purposeful Telemachus posed a far greater threat to their comfortable arrangement than the withdrawn, uncertain boy they had grown accustomed to ignoring. Under a sky still dark with the last stars of night, Telemachus and a small, loyal crew slipped their ship quietly from the harbor, unseen by suitors who slept off their nightly feasting within the palace walls. Athena herself sent a favorable wind to fill their sail, guiding them safely across the water toward the sandy shores of Pylos, kingdom of the aged King Nestor. Nestor was, by this point in his long life, one of the oldest and most venerated of all the Greek kings who had fought at Troy, a man who had already outlived 2 full generations of warriors and whose memory stretched back across decades of glory and grief in equal measure. When Telemachus arrived upon the shore, he found the elderly king in the midst of a great sacrifice to the sea god, surrounded by his sons and his people, the salt air thick with the smoke of roasting offerings. Rows of black bulls stood ready upon the sand, their horns freshly gilded for the occasion, while Nestor's sons moved among the gathered crowd, distributing portions of meat and pouring dark wine into the sea in tribute, the whole beach alive with the low murmur of prayer and the crackle of sacrificial fires. It was a scene of considerable splendor for so modest a kingdom, 9 great companies of men seated in ordered rows upon the sand, each company tending its own fire, its own offering, its own portion of the feast, and it spoke to a piety and an orderliness that Telemachus, accustomed by now to the chaos of his own suitor-plagued hall, could not help but notice and quietly admire. Nestor welcomed the young stranger with the warm and immediate hospitality every proper household owed a traveler, seating him among his own family, offering food and wine before so much as asking his name, for it was considered shameful among people of honor to question a guest before he had been properly fed and rested. Once the meal had settled, Telemachus found the courage to ask what he had sailed so far to learn. "Tell me, if you can," he said, "of my father, Odysseus, who fought beside you at Troy. Is he alive? Is he dead? I have grown to manhood not knowing, and I can bear the not knowing no longer." Nestor's answer was not the simple comfort Telemachus had hoped for, but something both more valuable and more painful, a long, honest recollection of the chaos that followed Troy's fall. When the war ended, the old king said, "We did not sail home together as one triumphant fleet. Bitter quarrels broke out among the leaders over how and when to depart, quarrels that angered the gods themselves, who felt insufficiently honored amid our celebrations. Some of us left at once, others delayed to make proper sacrifice, and in that scattering, no single man can say for certain what became of every hero who once stood beside him at Troy. I made it home swiftly enough, by the mercy of the gods, but many did not. Some drowned in shipwreck. Some were murdered by their own kin upon their return. Some simply vanished into rumor and silence, their fate unknown even to those who loved them best. Of your father, I can tell you only this. We parted ways early in the voyage home, when disagreement split our fleet, and from that day I have heard nothing certain, only fragments of rumor suggesting that of all the Greek commanders, Odysseus alone might still be delayed somewhere out in the wide world, unable, for reasons I cannot say, to complete his journey." Though this answer offered no clean resolution, it gave Telemachus something perhaps more valuable than simple confirmation, a broader understanding of the very world his father moved through, a world where even the greatest heroes of Troy could be undone not by monsters or armies, but by pride, poor judgment, and the displeasure of the gods. Nestor spoke to him, too, of the duties of kingship, of the importance of honoring the gods properly, of the dangers of arrogance even in victory, lessons that, whether or not Telemachus fully recognized it at the time, were quietly shaping him into the leader his father would one day need him to be. And so, with Nestor's own son as guide and companion, Telemachus set out across the Greek countryside until at last he arrived at the glittering palace of Sparta, ruled by King Menelaus, and, remarkably, his once abducted wife Helen, restored now to her husband's side after the long and terrible war fought in her name. The court he found himself standing within was unlike anything Ithaca could offer, a palace gleaming with bronze and gold and silver and amber, the wealth of a kingdom that had clearly prospered in the years since the war's end. Torchlight caught upon polished metal at every turn, upon cups of gold set out for the feast, upon amber beads woven into the hair of serving women, upon walls hung with fine dyed cloth that must have cost more than an entire season's harvest on Ithaca. Telemachus, raised in a household now stripped bare by parasitic guests, could not help but stare, however briefly, at such open, effortless abundance, a reminder of just how far his own home had fallen since his father's departure, and how much there still was, in this wider world beyond his small island, that he had never before had cause to imagine. Menelaus welcomed the traveler with the same instinctive hospitality Nestor had shown, seating him at a magnificent feast before any question of identity was raised, exactly as custom demanded. It was during that banquet that Helen herself descended from her private chambers with her attendants, and it is worth imagining the strange, charged atmosphere of that room. For here sat the very woman whose face had, according to legend, launched 1,000 ships and cost the lives of countless men on both sides of a 10-year war. Moving now through her husband's halls with the composed grace of a woman who had made an uneasy peace with the enormous weight of her own legend. It was Helen, with her sharp and perceptive eye, who first recognized something familiar in the young traveler's face, a resemblance so striking she remarked upon it before he had even given his name. "I have never seen a man resemble another so closely," she said, studying him across the firelight. "Surely this is the son of Odysseus. Look at the shape of his brow, the set of his eyes. I would know that face anywhere, having looked upon the father so many times during the long years of that terrible war." Menelaus, following his wife's gaze, agreed at once, and when Telemachus at last confirmed his identity and explained the purpose of his journey, husband and wife together shared with him what they knew, an account far closer to a genuine answer than anything Nestor had offered. Menelaus explained that on his own long and difficult voyage home, he had been driven off course and delayed for years in Egypt, where, through cunning and considerable struggle, he had managed to capture and question a shape-shifting sea spirit possessing knowledge of the fate of every Greek hero who had sailed from Troy. "From that reluctant spirit," Menelaus said, "I learned that your father lives, though he does not walk free. He is held upon a remote island, against his own will, by a nymph of considerable power who will not release him. I am told he weeps upon her shore each day, longing for a home he cannot reach." For Telemachus, this news struck with the force of both overwhelming relief and fresh anguish together. His father was alive. After 20 years of uncertainty, here at last was confirmation from a source too credible to dismiss. And yet his father remained, in the very same breath, revealed to be trapped, unable to return, his fate still unresolved. It was exactly the kind of answer that only deepens a longing rather than satisfying it. The confirmation that the person you love still lives, paired with the fresh knowledge that he remains, for now, entirely out of reach. It is here, with Telemachus still a guest within the glittering halls of Sparta, his heart caught between relief and renewed worry for a father he has still never truly known, that our story now turns away from Ithaca and its restless young prince, back across the wide and unforgiving sea, to the very island where Odysseus himself has spent so many long years, weeping and longing for the very home his son has only just begun to search for on his behalf. Far out in the western sea, beyond the reach of any trade route or fisherman's memory, there lay a small and beautiful island called Ogygia, so remote that even the gods themselves seemed to visit it rarely. It was here that Odysseus had spent the last 7 years of his life. To describe Ogygia is almost to describe paradise itself. The island was thick with fragrant cypress and alder, their branches home to nesting seabirds whose cries mixed with the constant murmur of 4 separate springs, their clear waters winding through soft meadows overgrown with violets and wild parsley. At the heart of this beauty stood a great cave, its entrance framed by a flourishing grapevine heavy with fruit, its interior warmed by a fire that always seemed to be burning, filling the air with the scent of cedar and sweet-smelling wood. It was, in every visible way, a place of extraordinary comfort, the kind of island a weary sailor might dream of during a long and dangerous voyage. And yet, for Odysseus, this paradise had become something closer to a beautifully decorated prison. The island belonged to a nymph named Calypso, a divine being of great beauty who had discovered him shipwrecked and nearly dead upon her shore many years before, the sole survivor of a disaster that claimed every man who had sailed with him. She had nursed him back to health, and in the years that followed she had come to love him, genuinely and deeply, in the way even divine beings, according to the old stories, were capable of loving a mortal man. She offered him comfort, safety, her own devoted companionship, and even, extraordinarily, the promise of immortality itself, should he agree to remain forever at her side, forsaking his old mortal life entirely. It is worth sitting with the strange weight of that offer, for it says something essential about the man at the center of this story. Here was a mortal offered the single greatest gift the ancient world could imagine, eternal life free of age and sickness and death, beside a beautiful and devoted immortal companion, in a paradise untouched by war or hardship. Any reasonable calculation of self-interest might suggest he accept without hesitation. And yet, night after night, year after year, Odysseus found himself hollow in the face of that offer. Each evening he walked alone to the rocky shore and sat facing the direction he believed his homeland to lie, and wept, not from any failure to recognize the beauty around him, nor from ingratitude toward the woman who loved him, but simply because none of it, however lovely, was his. His heart remained fixed upon a small, unremarkable island across the sea, upon an aging wife he had not seen in 2 decades, upon a son who had grown from infancy to manhood entirely without him. This is, perhaps, one of the quietest but most profound ideas at the very center of the Odyssey, that home is not merely a place of comfort, and love is not merely a matter of who is kind to you in the present moment. Home is the place that holds your history, your memory, your unfinished promises, and so Odysseus remained trapped upon a beautiful island with a goddess who loved him, unable to stop grieving for the imperfect, distant, achingly ordinary life he had left behind. In the evenings, it is said, Calypso would sing as she worked her golden loom, her voice filling the cave with a beauty no mortal singer could hope to match, and she would set out food and wine for him without being asked, anticipating his hunger before he felt it himself, tending to him with a devotion that might, under any other circumstance, have seemed the very picture of a happy union. And yet each night ended the same way, with Odysseus slipping from her side to sit upon the cold rocks facing the sea, staring toward a horizon that held nothing visible at all, only the direction in which he believed, with a certainty that defied 7 years of evidence to the contrary, that his home still waited for him. Calypso was not cruel in any obvious sense. She did not chain him or mistreat him. Hers was a gentler captivity, and in its gentleness crueler still, a captivity of comfort and longing intertwined, where he walked the island as he pleased, but was never free to leave it, because Calypso, loving him as she did, could not bring herself to let him go. It was after 7 years of this strange, suspended sorrow that the story shifts our gaze upward entirely, away from the mortal world, to the shining halls of Olympus, where the gods themselves had gathered in council. Picture a realm bathed in a light unlike any sunrise ever witnessed upon the earth below, a light without shadow or season, where the immortals reclined at their ease, feasting and debating the fortunes of mortal men as casually as a family discussing a distant relative's troubles. It was here that Athena rose before the assembly and addressed Zeus directly, her words carrying the particular frustration of someone who has waited far too long for an injustice to be set right. "Father," she said, "must Odysseus suffer forever for a grievance not entirely his own making? He alone among the heroes who survived Troy remains trapped, kept from his home not through any offense against the gods, but because Poseidon's private anger has been allowed to stretch on, unresolved, for years beyond any reasonable measure. And while he weeps upon a stranger's island, His own household on Ithaca is being devoured by men who show no respect for the very laws of hospitality that we ourselves are meant to protect. Surely whatever debt Poseidon believes is owed him, it cannot justify the ruin of an entire family. The other gods gathered in that hall murmured their agreement, for Athena's argument touched upon something every one of them, in their own fashion, held sacred, the delicate order of obligation and honor that bound gods and mortals together, an order that could not long survive if the suffering of one blameless household were allowed to continue purely to satisfy a grievance that, however justified, had already stretched across the better part of a decade. Zeus, weighing his daughter's argument, found himself largely persuaded, for even divine justice, as the Greeks imagined it, held its limits. Poseidon's anger was real and, by the standards of that world, justified, a debt owed for a genuine wrong done to his son. But a grudge could not stretch on forever without eventually yielding to mercy, particularly once the punished man had suffered so long that the debt might reasonably be considered paid. "You speak fairly," Zeus said at last. "And as it happens, Poseidon is far from this council even now, occupied with matters to the south. Let us act while he is absent to object. Hermes, go at once to the island of Ogygia, and tell the nymph Calypso that it is my will Odysseus be released, that he may build himself a vessel and finish, at last, the journey home that has been delayed far too long." Hermes, wearing the golden sandals that carried him across sky and sea as easily as a bird upon the wind, descended from Olympus and crossed the wide ocean until he came upon Calypso's solitary island. He found the nymph within her fragrant cave, singing softly as she worked at her golden loom, and when he delivered the command of Zeus, her reaction was one of unguarded grief. "So it is decided, then, without so much as a word to me," she said, her voice tight with a bitterness she made no effort to hide. "You gods permit yourselves such freedom with mortal women, and none among you thinks to object. Yet let a goddess love a mortal man, and at once the whole of Olympus conspires to take him from her." "I bring only the word of Zeus," Hermes answered gently. "And you know as well as I that his command cannot simply be set aside, however unjust it may feel to you now." Calypso did not hide her sorrow at the unfairness of it, but she understood, as every god and goddess understood, that the will of Zeus, once spoken, could not be ignored, whatever grief it cost her personally. And so, with a heavy heart, she resolved to obey. Calypso found Odysseus, as she so often did, seated alone upon the rocky shore, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his heart, as always, elsewhere. "You may leave this island," she told him, and the words themselves seemed to cost her something as she spoke them. "I will help you build a vessel and provision it and see you safely on your way." The news must have arrived with an almost disorienting mixture of joy and disbelief, the particular shock of hearing, after 7 years of hopeless longing, that the thing you had stopped quite believing might ever happen was suddenly, finally, real. There is something worth noting in how carefully the old story lingers over the practical labor of that departure, refusing to rush past it in favor of some instant, magical crossing. Calypso led him to a stand of tall trees near the shore, alder and poplar and towering fir, dry and well-suited to shipbuilding, and gave him a bronze axe and an adze, the proper tools of a craftsman. Odysseus, drawing on skills that stretched back to a life before the war, before even his years as a young king, set to work with his own hands, felling 20 trees in all, trimming and smoothing each trunk with careful, patient labor. Over the days that followed, working alone but for Calypso's occasional guidance, he shaped these logs into a proper raft, joining the timbers with wooden pegs, building up a sturdy deck, raising a mast, and fashioning a steering oar to guide its course. Calypso contributed what only a goddess could provide: cloth for a sail woven by her own hand, generous stores of bread and wine and water, and a favorable wind. She raised herself to carry him safely on his way. 4 full days of steady work passed before the raft stood finished, and it is worth imagining the strange, quiet intimacy of those days. A mortal man and the goddess who loved him working side by side to build the very vessel that would carry him from her forever, both of them fully aware of what the labor meant, neither one choosing to dwell too openly upon the sorrow of it. On the 5th day, Calypso bathed him, dressed him in fine clothing suited for a long voyage, and helped him load the raft with provisions. As he pushed off from the shore at last, catching the wind in his newly woven sail, Odysseus must have felt a complicated swell of feeling indeed. The joy of finally moving toward home after 7 long years of stillness tangled together with a quieter grief at leaving behind a companion who had, in her own complicated way, cared for him. Deeply through the whole of his exile, he steered by the stars, keeping the constellation of the Great Bear always upon his left hand exactly as Calypso had instructed, sailing steadily for 17 days without incident, the first true progress toward home he had made in nearly 2 decades. But on the 18th day, with the shadowy outline of land at last visible upon the horizon, disaster found him once again. Poseidon, returning at that very moment from his long journey to the far south, happened to look down and catch sight of the small raft cutting across his domain. He recognized at once the man aboard it, and his old fury flared instantly back to life. Here was the very mortal whose blinding of his beloved son had earned Poseidon's lasting hatred, sailing freely across the sea in his own absence, released, apparently, without so much as a word to him. "So the others have set him loose behind my back," Poseidon is said to have muttered, raising his great trident and striking the surface of the sea. Clouds gathered together until the sky itself seemed to close like a fist above the small, fragile raft. Winds converged violently from every direction at once, the fierce north wind clashing against the wet south, the stormy west battling sharp gusts from the east, churning the sea into chaos. Mountains of crashing water rising where only moments before there had been calm. Odysseus, alone upon his small wooden raft, felt his heart sink at the sight of that gathering storm, and it is said that in this terrible moment he found himself wishing almost that he had died gloriously at Troy alongside his fellow soldiers, rather than facing this lonely, anonymous death upon an empty sea, his body destined never even to be found or properly honored. Rain came in stinging sheets, driven sideways by the howling wind, and lightning split the blackened sky again and again, throwing brief, terrible glimpses of the sea's true violence. Walls of water rising higher than the mast itself before collapsing down upon the small raft with a force that seemed to shake the very timbers beneath his feet. Odysseus lashed himself as best he could to the deck, his hands raw from gripping the ropes, salt water filling his mouth and stinging his eyes, the horizon lost entirely behind curtain after curtain of driving rain. The waves grew mountainous, crashing over his small vessel again and again, until a single massive wave struck with such overwhelming force that it tore the steering oar from his hands and snapped the mast in two, casting him from the raft and down into the churning, freezing water. For a long, terrifying moment he was pulled beneath the surface, the weight of his soaked clothing dragging him downward, his lungs burning, the world above reduced to a distant, wavering light through dark water. When at last he fought his way back up, gasping, he found his ruined raft nearby and clung to it desperately, using every ounce of a lifetime's experience as a sailor simply to stay alive amid waves determined to tear him apart. It was at this darkest moment that help arrived from an unexpected quarter. A minor sea goddess, moved to pity by the sight of the battered man clinging to his broken raft, rose briefly from the waves and offered him a strange and precious gift, a length of shimmering veil. "Bind this beneath your chest," she told him, "and you need not fear drowning. When you near land, abandon the raft, strip away your heavy clothing, and swim the remaining distance. Once you are safely ashore, cast the veil back into the sea, and do not look behind you as you do." Odysseus, cautious even in his most desperate hour after so many years of hard-won experience with gods both helpful and harmful, hesitated briefly. But when another great wave shattered what remained of his raft entirely, leaving him no other choice, he bound the veil beneath his chest and struck out swimming through the wild, storm-tossed water. For 2 full days and nights he was tossed helplessly upon the heaving sea, swimming when he could, simply struggling to stay afloat when the waves grew too violent for any progress at all, his body weakening with exhaustion, hunger, and the relentless cold. It was, without question, one of the most punishing trials of his entire 20-year ordeal, a battle not against monster or army but against the sheer indifferent power of the sea itself, wielded with focused fury by a god determined to see him drowned rather than allow him safe passage home on the third day. At last, the storm began to loosen its grip, and as dawn broke calm and golden over the water, Odysseus caught sight of land ahead, a wooded coastline rising gently from the sea, its shore fringed with rock, and, further along, a stretch of gently sloping sandy beach where a river met the sea in a quiet, sheltered inlet. Summoning what little strength remained in his battered body, he swam the final distance, fighting past jagged rocks that threatened to tear him apart against their sharp edges, until at last he found the mouth of a gentle river and allowed its current to carry him safely inward, away from the crashing surf, into calmer water where he could finally stand. What followed was a moment of complete physical collapse. Odysseus dragged himself from the water onto the sand, his body scraped and salt-crusted and utterly spent after 3 days without food or rest, fighting for his life against both sea and storm. Before losing himself to unconsciousness, he honored the spirit of the river that had carried him safely to shore, then unbound the enchanted veil from beneath his chest, as instructed, and cast it back into the water without looking behind him. Only then did he allow himself to search for shelter. Nearby, he found a thicket where 2 olive trees grew close together, their branches so thickly intertwined that neither wind, nor rain, nor even direct sunlight could easily penetrate the shelter beneath them. He gathered a great heap of fallen leaves and burrowed down into their midst until he was entirely covered, hidden from view and reasonably protected from the chill of the open night. And there, at last, safe on solid ground for the first time in nearly 3 weeks, the exhausted king of Ithaca fell into a deep and desperately needed sleep, watched over, it is said, by Athena herself, who caused a gentle drowsiness to settle over his eyes and ensured that no harm would come to him as he rested. He had washed ashore, though he did not yet know it, upon the coast of a kingdom called Scyria, home to a seafaring people known as the Phaeacians, a fortunate landing indeed, for the Phaeacians were renowned across the ancient world not only for their extraordinary skill as sailors, but for their deep and genuine devotion to the sacred laws of hospitality, making them, of all the peoples he might have encountered on this unfamiliar shore, very possibly the best suited to help a stranded, storm-battered stranger find his way home at last. While Odysseus slept, hidden beneath his canopy of olive leaves, Athena turned her attention to another figure entirely, the young princess of this island kingdom, a girl named Nausicaa, daughter of the Phaeacian king Alcinous and his wise queen Arete. Nausicaa stood, at this point in her life, at the very edge of adulthood, a young woman of striking beauty who had recently begun to think, with the natural curiosity of someone her age, about marriage and the household she might one day govern as a wife. Athena, disguising herself in a dream as one of the princess's close friends, appeared to her that very night, gently chiding her for neglecting the household's laundry and suggesting, with a knowing subtlety, that a young woman soon to be married ought to take particular care that her own clothing, and that of her family, be properly clean and presentable, for who could say when suitors might begin to take a serious interest in her? Nausicaa woke the next morning with this dream fresh in her mind, and, following its suggestion with the eager enthusiasm of youth, went at once to ask her father for the use of a wagon and mules, so that she and her attendant maidens might carry the household's soiled garments down to the river to be washed. Alcinous, seeing no reason to refuse so reasonable a request, readily agreed. And so it was that Nausicaa and her companions set off that morning toward the very river mouth where Odysseus, unbeknownst to any of them, lay sleeping nearby beneath his olive trees. The princess and her maidens spent the morning at their work, washing garments in the river's clear water, treading them clean within stone-lined pools before wringing them out and laying them along the sandy bank to dry beneath a warm and cloudless sky. Around them the shoreline stretched wide and empty, fringed by dune grass bending gently in the sea breeze, gulls wheeling overhead against a sky washed pale with morning light. Afterward, their labor finished, they bathed themselves in the river and anointed their skin with rich olive oil before sharing a simple meal upon the grass. And then, their hunger satisfied, they turned to play, casting aside their veils and tossing a ball back and forth along the shore in cheerful, unguarded games, their laughter rising bright over the sound of the surf, Nausicaa herself moving among them with the easy, luminous grace that Athena had long ago marked her out for, a beauty set to rival the goddesses themselves, though tempered always by a warmth and modesty that made her, in the eyes of everyone who knew her, as beloved as she was admired. It was the sudden cry of the maidens, when an errant throw sent their ball splashing into the water, that finally roused Odysseus from his exhausted sleep. Waking suddenly amid his bed of leaves, uncertain for a moment where he even was, he faced an immediate and delicate dilemma, for he was entirely naked, having discarded his ruined clothing before swimming ashore, and covered from head to foot in dried sea brine and scratches from his ordeal, hardly a presentable sight with which to approach a group of young noble women. And yet he desperately needed help if he hoped to survive at all in this unfamiliar land. Breaking off a leafy branch to cover himself with some measure of modesty, he emerged from the thicket and approached the group, his appearance so wild and sea-battered that every maiden but Nausicaa herself fled immediately in fright, scattering along the beach. Nausicaa alone stood her ground, and it is this single moment of composed courage that the old story asks us to admire above almost anything else in this part of the tale. Odysseus, drawing on the very same tact and careful diplomacy that had served him so well throughout his ordeal, stopped at a respectful distance rather than rushing toward her, and spoke. "I kneel before you," he said, "though I do not know whether you are a mortal woman or a goddess walking the earth in mortal form, for such is your beauty and your bearing. I have suffered greatly, cast up alone upon this shore after many days at sea, and I have nothing, no clothing, no companions, no notion of where I have landed. I ask only for a scrap of cloth to cover myself, and some direction toward the nearest town, and in return, may the gods grant you everything your heart desires, a husband, a household, and a marriage blessed with harmony, for there is no finer thing in this world than a husband and wife who keep one house in true accord." Nausicaa, moved by both his evident suffering and the remarkable grace of his approach, answered without hesitation, "Stranger, you seem neither foolish nor wicked, and it is Zeus himself who sends both fortune and hardship to men as he wills, so we must not scorn you for what has befallen you. You have come to the land of the Phaeacians, and this island is ruled by my father, Alcinous. Rest assured, you shall have clothing and food and safe passage into our city." She called her frightened attendants back, instructed them to provide him with oil and clean garments and a private place to bathe. And when Odysseus emerged from the river, freshly washed and dressed, Athena herself lent a final touch of divine grace to his appearance, making him seem taller and more strikingly handsome than before, so that Nausicaa, watching him transformed from the wild castaway of moments before into a man of clear nobility and bearing, found herself struck by an admiration. She was careful, given her tender age, not to express too openly. Mindful of her own reputation and the inevitable gossip of a small kingdom, she arranged for him to follow her party back toward the city at a discreet distance rather than walking beside her openly, explaining that she did not wish to invite unkind rumor about her own conduct with an unknown stranger. She instructed him carefully on how to find his way once they neared the palace, advising him to seek out her mother, Queen Arete, first of all, for it was Arate's favor, even more than the king's own authority, that would determine whether he received the full hospitality of their court. Following Nausicaa's careful instructions, Odysseus made his way at last into the city of the Phaeacians, and found himself standing before a palace of such extraordinary splendor that even a well-traveled king, one who had witnessed the great halls of Troy and the wealth of Mycenae, might have paused in genuine astonishment. Bronze walls gleamed beneath a frieze of deep blue enamel. Golden doors fitted upon posts of solid silver guarded the entrance, and golden and silver hounds, crafted by the god of the forge himself, according to legend, stood eternal watch on either side, never aging, never tiring. Within, golden youths held aloft blazing torches to light the halls after dark, their light catching upon polished floors and richly woven tapestries hung along every wall, while high above, a ceiling of dark, gleaming wood arched overhead like the hull of some great overturned ship. All around the palace grounds stretched a magnificent orchard, heavy year-round with pears and pomegranates and apples and figs and olives, the trees never failing, never resting through any season, so that fruit ripened continuously beneath a sun and wind that seemed to favor this one corner of the world above all others, watered by two ever-flowing springs, one feeding the orchard, the other channeled beneath the courtyard itself for the convenience of the people. Vineyards climbed in ordered rows along a sunlit slope nearby, tended by hands as skilled as any in the known world, for the Phaeacians, whatever else might be said of them, took evident and considerable pride in the beauty of the home the gods had granted them. Guided by a protective mist, Athena drew around him to prevent any hostile challenge before he could state his purpose. Odysseus passed unnoticed through the busy palace grounds until he came before the great hall itself, where King Alcinous and Queen Arete sat feasting among their assembled nobles. Following Nausicaa's advice precisely, he moved directly toward Arete, and in a gesture of humble supplication understood across the ancient world, knelt and embraced her knees, appealing to her, and to her husband, and to the whole assembled court, for safe passage home to whatever family still awaited him. The hall fell into a long, startled silence at the sight of this dust and sworn stranger kneeling before their queen, until at last an elderly and much-respected nobleman spoke up, gently reminding Alcinous that it was neither proper nor honorable to leave a suppliant kneeling upon the floor in silence. The king, recovering himself, rose at once, raised the stranger to his feet with his own hand, and seated him in a place of honor beside his own son, calling immediately for food and wine to be brought, exactly as the sacred customs of hospitality demanded, delaying any question of the stranger's name or troubles until he had first been properly fed and made welcome. It is worth pausing to appreciate just how central this act of hospitality was to the entire moral world the Odyssey inhabits. Time and again throughout this story, travelers arrive unannounced upon foreign shores, and time and again, the true measure of a civilized people is shown to lie in how generously and immediately they extend comfort to strangers, without first demanding to know whether that stranger deserves it. The Phaeacians, offering food and shelter and honor before even learning his name, exemplify this ideal in its most complete form. The scent of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the hall that evening, mingled with the sweetness of wine poured generously from great mixing bowls of bronze and silver, while serving girls moved quietly between the long tables, refilling cups and setting down platters heaped with fish caught fresh from the surrounding waters. Beyond the open doors, the sound of the sea could be heard rolling gently against the shore, a soft and steady counterpoint to the laughter and conversation filling the hall, and torchlight flickered warm against walls of polished bronze, throwing long shadows that danced with every movement of the crowd. That evening, once the meal had concluded, Alcinous called for further festivities in the stranger's honor. A blind poet named Demonicus was summoned to the hall, gifted by the gods with the ability to sing of events he had never personally witnessed, and he began to perform a song recounting episodes from the Great War at Troy, the very war from which Odysseus himself had so recently, and at such tremendous cost, returned. As the poet's song filled the hall, describing battles and heroes that every person present, save Odysseus, understood only as distant legend, something extraordinary occurred. Odysseus, seated in his place of honor among strangers who did not yet know his true identity, found himself overcome, quietly, by grief he could no longer contain. He drew his cloak up over his face to hide his tears, weeping silently as the poet's verses summoned back memories of fallen companions and a war that had cost him 10 years of his life even before his perilous journey home had begun. Alcinous alone seemed to notice this reaction, observing his guest's hidden sorrow with quiet, careful attention, though he said nothing of it at the time, allowing the song to continue and the feast to proceed. The following day, Alcinous called the young nobles of his court together upon the open ground beside the harbor, where contests of running, wrestling, discus, and boxing were held in the stranger's honor, the Phaeacian youths displaying their strength and agility before the assembled crowd with evident pride, for they were, by their own reckoning, unmatched sailors, though perhaps not unmatched athletes, and it was not long before one among them, a brash young man impatient with the quiet stranger's reluctance to join the games, needled Odysseus openly, suggesting he looked more like a merchant counting his profits than a man who had ever tested his strength in honest competition. The remark stung, and Odysseus, rising to the challenge despite the ache still lingering in his storm-battered limbs, seized a discus far heavier than any the young men had yet thrown and sent it sailing well beyond every mark already made in the sand, silencing the crowd and reminding them all, in a single motion, that appearances could deceive even the most confident observer. That evening, the feasting resumed, and this pattern repeated itself more than once over the following hours of celebration, moments of joy interrupted by this same quiet grief, as further songs of Troy stirred memories he could not entirely suppress, however hard he tried to maintain his composure before his hosts. At last, having observed this sorrow enough times to feel certain something significant lay behind it, Alcinous set aside the customary patience of hospitality and addressed his guest directly. "Tell us, stranger," he said, not unkindly, "your name, your homeland, and the nature of the sorrow that so clearly weighs upon you. For surely no ordinary traveler weeps so deeply and so often at songs of a war fought and finished so many years ago. Tell us where the winds have carried you, and what lands you have seen, and what suffering has brought you to our shore. And do not hide your name from us out of modesty, for no man, whether noble or humble, ever entirely lacks a name." The entire hall fell silent, waiting. Queen Arete watched him closely, having herself noticed certain details about his borrowed clothing that suggested a story more complicated than a simple shipwreck. Nausicaa, seated quietly among the household, could not help but steal glances toward the stranger whose arrival on her morning at the river had already begun to feel like the opening chapter of some far larger story than she yet understood. And Odysseus, this man who had spent 20 years concealing his identity when it served his survival, who had outwitted kings and monsters alike through careful silence and clever deception, found himself, in this single moment, finally ready to set aside the disguise of the anonymous stranger. He drew a long, steadying breath, lifted his eyes to meet the expectant gaze of the assembled court, and at last began to speak the words that would end his long silence. "I am Odysseus," he said, "son of Laertes, known among men for my many stratagems, and my fame has reached the very heavens themselves. My home is Ithaca, a rugged island beneath the open sky, and it is a home I have not seen in 20 long years." A murmur swept through the hall at the sound of that name, a name every person present had heard sung in connection with the great trick of the wooden horse, the very stratagem that had finally brought down the walls of Troy. But before anyone could press him further, before Alcinous or Arete or young Nausicaa could ask the 1,000 questions now clearly forming behind their startled expressions, Odysseus raised a hand gently for their patience. "If you wish to hear the whole of my suffering," he said, "the whole strange and terrible account of everything that has befallen me since the fall of Troy, you must settle in, for it is not a short tale to tell." And so, as the fire burned low in the great hall of the Phaeacians, and every noble present leaned forward in rapt and eager silence, Odysseus, king of Ithaca, drew one final steadying breath before the gathered court, and began, at last, to tell the story of everything that had happened to him in the 20 years since he had sailed away from his home and the family he loved, into a war, and then into a nightmare of gods and monsters and endless wandering seas that he had only now, after so long, begun to survive. When the walls of Troy had fallen, Odysseus began, his voice low and steady in the firelit hall, and the smoke of that burning city still clung to our clothes and our hair. We loaded our ships and turned our prows toward home, every man among us certain that the worst of our trials lay behind us. We could not have been more wrong. The wind carried us first to the land of the Ciconies, a people allied with Troy, and finding their city of Ismarus lightly defended, we fell upon it as soldiers long starved of plunder will do, sacking the town, seizing what wealth and provisions we could carry, and dividing the spoils fairly among the fleet so that no man went without his share. It should have ended there, he told them, a single swift raid, a fair division of spoils, and a quick departure before word could spread and bring retribution down upon their heads. This was the wisdom of every experienced raider, to strike quickly and vanish before the enemy could rally. But his men, flush with victory and heavy with captured wine, refused to listen to his warnings. They lingered on that shore through the night, slaughtering sheep and cattle for a feast, drinking deeply from jars of dark wine looted from Ismarus's cellars, laughing and boasting around their fires as though the war itself had taught them nothing at all about the dangers of overconfidence. I begged them to load the ships and go, Odysseus said, but they would not hear me. They called me overly cautious, said I had grown soft with worry after so many years of war, and continued their feasting long into the night while I paced the shoreline alone, watching the dark hills beyond the town for any sign of movement. His caution proved justified. The Sicanies who had fled inland at the first attack did not scatter and disappear, as a lesser people might have. They gathered reinforcements from neighboring tribes further inland, men skilled with spear and horse, and as dawn broke gray and cold over the beach, they came pouring down from the hills in numbers far greater than anything the raiders had expected, their ranks so thick, Odysseus said, that they seemed to spring up from the earth itself like the leaves and flowers of springtime, an image of terrible, overwhelming abundance. The battle that followed was fierce and desperate, fought in the confusion of gray morning light with men still shaking off the fog of wine and celebration. And though Odysseus's crews fought bravely, holding their ground stubbornly beside their ships from dawn until the sun stood high overhead, the sheer weight of numbers eventually told against them. When at last they broke and fled to their ships, 6 men from each vessel had been lost, cut down upon that foreign shore, their bodies left behind in the haste of retreat, a debt of grief that Odysseus carried with him for the rest of the voyage. We called out 3 times to each dead companion as custom demanded, he told the silent hall, and then we rowed away from that shore with heavy hearts, having learned, at terrible cost, that even a war 10 years won teaches a man nothing if he does not also learn caution alongside his victories. The sea, as though sensing this fresh grief, seemed to turn against them almost immediately. A great storm rose from the north as they sailed onward, tearing at their sails, driving rain into their faces, forcing them to strike their masts and row for their very lives beneath towering waves for 2 full days and nights, until at last the wind relented and allowed them to make repairs and continue on their way, though considerably further off course than they had intended, driven south of their proper route by winds no navigator could have anticipated or resisted. It was some days after this storm, sailing still without clear bearing, that they came upon a strange and gentle-seeming shore, a land where the wind itself seemed to soften, where the very air carried a heaviness unlike anything in the ordinary world. Odysseus sent 3 of his men ashore to explore this new country and learn what manner of people lived there, and it was here that his crew first encountered the peculiar and dangerous hospitality of the Lotus Eaters. These were not, in any way, a hostile or violent people, Odysseus explained. They did not raise weapons against my men, nor did they seek to rob or deceive them. Instead, they offered them food, a strange, sweet-flowering plant that grew abundantly across their land, and my men, being hungry and grateful for what appeared to be simple kindness, ate freely of it. What followed was more troubling than any battle. The moment his men tasted the lotus flower, all thought of home, of ships, of companions waiting for their return, dissolved entirely from their minds, replaced by a drowsy, perfect contentment that asked for nothing more than to remain exactly where they were, eating the sweet flower forever, forgetting entirely that they had ever had a purpose beyond this shore. When Odysseus went ashore himself to learn what had delayed his scouts, he found them sitting placidly among the native people, refusing outright to return to the ships, weeping when he insisted, not from sorrow at being taken from this place, but from grief at the very thought of leaving. I dragged them back myself, he said, weeping and struggling against me the entire way, and had them bound beneath the rowing benches so they could not throw themselves back onto that shore, for I feared that if I gave them even a moment's freedom, every man who had tasted the lotus would abandon the fleet entirely and choose to forget his home and family forever, content to grow old and die on that gentle, forgetful shore, remembering nothing, wanting nothing, and troubled by nothing. He ordered the rest of the crew to board at once and row hard away from that dangerous coast. and it was only once the shore of the Lotus Eaters had shrunk entirely from view that his bound and weeping men slowly came back to themselves, shame replacing the drowsy contentment that had gripped them, though even then, he admitted, some of them confessed a lingering longing for the peace of that terrible, forgetful shore. From that gentle, dangerous shore, Odysseus continued, we sailed on until we came upon an island unlike any we had yet encountered, a wild and untended land where goats grazed freely upon the hillsides, and the soil, though never plowed by any human hand, seemed rich enough to yield abundant crops if only someone had cared to plant them. We anchored offshore for a night, and the following morning, curiosity and hunger together drove me to take my own ship and its crew to explore the mainland beyond, a rocky coast where, as we drew nearer, we could make out the mouth of a great cave near the shore, its opening overgrown with laurel, and beyond it, folds for sheep and goats built of heavy, uncut stone. He chose 12 of his best men to accompany him ashore, he told them, and took with him, on some instinct he could not fully explain even now, a skin of extraordinarily potent wine, a gift from a priest he had spared during the sack of Ismarus. Wine so strong that it was customarily diluted with 20 parts water to 1, and so fragrant that even the priest's own household had marveled at it. As they rowed toward that unfamiliar coast, Odysseus said, a strange unease had settled over the whole crew, for the island's very emptiness felt wrong in a way none of them could name. No smoke rising from any hearth, no boats drawn up on any beach, no sound of human voices carrying across the water, only the distant bleating of goats and the crash of surf against black volcanic rock. I do not know, even now, what made me carry that wine with me that day, he admitted. Perhaps some god whispered a warning I did not consciously hear. Perhaps it was simple habit, the caution of a man who had learned, at Ismarus, never to venture into unknown territory without something of value to offer or to use. The cave itself, when they finally stood before it, struck every man in that small party as strange even before they set foot inside. Its entrance so vast and so roughly hewn from the living rock that no ordinary shepherd could have needed a dwelling of such scale, and a smell hung about the place, Odysseus recalled, thick and animal and unfamiliar, mixed with the sharper tang of curdling milk. They found the great cave abandoned when they entered it, its owner out upon the hillside with his flocks, but the evidence of its owner's nature was immediately, overwhelmingly apparent. Pens crowded with lambs and kids stood along one wall. Great baskets groaned under the weight of cheeses. Pails and bowls of a size no ordinary man could have crafted or used stood filled with whey and fresh milk. Odysseus's men, taking in the sheer scale of everything around them, begged him to seize what cheese and livestock they could carry and flee back to the ship before whatever giant creature owned this cave returned to find them there. It was, in hindsight, exactly the wisdom that had saved them at Ismarus, and it was advice that Odysseus, driven this time by a curiosity he would come to regret bitterly, chose to ignore. I wished to see what manner of being lived here, he confessed to the silent hall, his voice heavy with the particular shame of a man recounting his own worst decision. I wished to know whether he would offer us the guest gifts our customs demand of any host. And so I told my men we would wait, and see, and trust in the sacred laws of hospitality that every civilized being, mortal or otherwise, was expected to honor. It was the gravest misjudgment of my entire life. They did not have long to wait. As the sun began sinking toward evening, the ground itself seemed to shudder beneath an approaching weight, and into the cave came a creature so massive that Odysseus's men shrank back instinctively into the shadows at the sight of him, driving his flocks before him, then sealing the cave's entrance behind him with a boulder so enormous that 22 heavy wagons together could not have shifted it from where he set it down. This was Polyphemus, a cyclops, one of a race of giant, solitary shepherds with a single vast eye set in the center of each forehead, a being who lived apart from all human law, honoring neither Zeus nor any other god, answerable to no one but his own appetite and his own considerable strength. Polyphemus went about his evening chores, milking his ewes and goats with practiced efficiency, setting half the milk to curdle for cheese and drinking the rest, entirely unaware, until he had built up his fire, that he was not alone in his cave. When the firelight at last revealed the huddled, terrified strangers pressed against the cave wall, the giant's single eye fixed upon them with an expression Odysseus could only describe as curious rather than immediately hostile. Though the sheer wrongness of that vast, unblinking eye staring down at his small band of men was enough, he admitted, to freeze the breath in every throat present. Strangers, the giant rumbled, his voice shaking loose dust from the cave ceiling. Who are you, and where do you hail from? Are you traitors, or do you wander the sea as pirates do, risking your lives to bring ruin upon other men? Odysseus answered as carefully and respectfully as he could manage, explaining that they were Greeks returning from the war at Troy, blown off their course by contrary winds, and appealing, as custom demanded of any host confronted with shipwrecked strangers, to the sacred laws of hospitality that Zeus himself was said to watch over and protect. We ask for whatever gift a generous host customarily offers a stranger, he said, for it is Zeus who avenges the wronged guest and the wronged suppliant alike. The Cyclops' response chilled every man in that cave more thoroughly than any winter storm. He laughed, a great booming sound that echoed off the stone walls, and told them plainly that Cyclopes cared nothing whatsoever for Zeus or any other god, being far mightier than such feeble deities by his own reckoning, and that he would show them hospitality only as it suited his own appetite, and not a moment before. Without further warning, he lunged forward with terrible speed for a creature his size, seized two of Odysseus's men in his massive hands, and dashed them against the cave floor with such brutal force that their bodies broke apart entirely. And then, to the horror of everyone still watching, he devoured them whole, flesh and bone together, washing the meal down with deep draughts of unmixed milk, before lying down among his flocks and falling into a heavy, contented sleep, as though he had done nothing more remarkable than finish an ordinary supper. I confess, Odysseus told the hushed Phaeacian court, that in that moment, watching my own men consumed before my eyes, I very nearly drew my sword and drove it into his side as he slept, for the rage and grief within me demanded some immediate action. But some clearer part of my mind held me back even then, for I understood, even through my horror, that though we might kill the giant while he slept, we ourselves would then be trapped forever inside that cave, for no strength among us, however great, could hope to move the boulder he had sealed across the entrance, a stone so vast that our combined efforts would have accomplished nothing at all. And so I held my blade, and endured a night of grief and horror beside the sleeping monster who had just devoured two of my own companions, waiting for whatever the dawn might bring. The dawn brought no relief. Polyphemus woke, milked his flocks again with the same unhurried efficiency as before, and then, before driving his sheep out to pasture for the day, seized two more of Odysseus's men and made of them his morning meal, exactly as he had the evening before rolling the great boulder aside just enough to let his flocks pass through, and sealing it again behind him with the same terrible ease, as though it weighed no more to him than a common door might weigh to an ordinary man, leaving Odysseus and his remaining companions trapped within, for of their number already lost, with no clear path to survival, and a monster who would surely return that evening as hungry as before it was during those long, fearful hours of imprisonment that Odysseus devised the plan that would, in time, become one of the most celebrated feats of cunning in the whole of his story. Among the supplies left in the cave, he noticed a great, seasoned staff of olive wood, drawing against one wall, roughly the size and thickness of a ship's mast, evidently intended by Polyphemus for some future use as a walking staff once it had properly cured. Odysseus and his remaining men cut a length from this staff, perhaps as tall as a man is tall, and sharpened one end to a fine point, hardening it further in the glowing coals of the giant's own fire, before hiding the weapon carefully beneath a heap of dung scattered across the cave floor, where Polyphemus would never think to look for it. When the giant returned that evening, driving his flocks before him and sealing the entrance once more, he settled in for his usual routine of milking and feeding, and it was at this point that Odysseus made his move, approaching the giant with a bowl of the same powerful, undiluted wine he had carried with him from the ship, and offering it as a gift. "Cyclops," Odysseus said, keeping his voice as steady and deferential as he could manage, "here, drink this after your meal of human flesh. that you may see what manner of drink our ship carried before you destroyed it. I brought it as an offering, hoping you might take pity on us and send us on our way." Polyphemus, intrigued despite himself, drank the wine down, and finding it far richer and more pleasurable than anything he had ever tasted, demanded more at once, praising the drink and asking, almost as an afterthought, for the stranger's name, promising, with what might almost have passed for genuine goodwill, that he would give Odysseus a guest gift in return for such a fine offering. Here Odysseus offered the answer that would prove, in time, the very key to his men's escape. "My name," he said, "is Nobody. That is what my mother and father call me, and what all my friends call me as well." "Then, Nobody," the giant answered, already slurring slightly with drink, "I will eat your companions first, and you last of all. That shall be my guest gift to you." And with that, laughing at his own dark humor, he collapsed backward into a deep, wine-soaked sleep, his enormous body sprawled among his flocks, his single eye finally closed. This was the moment Odysseus and his remaining men had been waiting for through 2 days of terror and grief. They retrieved the sharpened stake from its hiding place beneath the dung, heated its point once more in the dying coals of the fire until it glowed fiercely, and then, with 4 of the bravest men helping him drive it, Odysseus plunged the burning point directly into the giant's single closed eye, leaning his whole weight upon it and twisting it as a shipwright twists a drill boring through a ship's timber. The eye hissing and sizzling around the burning wood exactly as hot metal hisses when a smith plunges it into cold water to temper the blade. Polyphemus's scream, when it came, was a sound Odysseus said he would carry with him to the end of his days, a howl of such raw agony and fury that it shook loose stones from the cave's ceiling, and the giant, blinded and thrashing in his pain, tore the stake from his ruined eye and began calling out desperately into the night for the other Cyclopes who lived scattered across the neighboring hills, his fellow giants, to come to his aid. They gathered outside his sealed cave, calling in through the stone to ask what terrible thing had befallen him, whether some man was trying to kill him by force or trickery. "Nobody is killing me by trickery," Polyphemus roared back through the boulder blocking his door. "Nobody is killing me by force." His fellow Cyclopes, hearing this answer, could only conclude that no one at all was attacking him, that his pain must be some sickness sent by the gods themselves, against which no mortal remedy could help. And so, grumbling about being woken for nothing, they returned to their own caves and their own sleep, leaving Polyphemus alone with his agony and his fury, and leaving Odysseus's clever deception, hidden inside the false name he had offered the night before, to work exactly as he had hoped it would. But escape remained far from certain, for the boulders still sealed the cave, and Polyphemus, blind now but far from harmless, spent the remainder of that night groping along the cave's entrance, feeling for any sign that his prisoners might try to slip past him in the darkness. Here Odysseus devised a second stroke of cunning to match his first. He selected the largest and finest rams from among the giant's flock, bound them together in groups of 3 using the twisted willow branches Polyphemus used for bedding, and had each of his remaining men cling to the underside of the middle ram in each group, hidden beneath the animal's thick wool, gripping tightly to its fleece as the beast walked. For himself, he chose the largest ram in the entire flock, a magnificent creature far bigger than any other, and clung beneath its belly alone, wrapping his arms around its wool and holding on with every remaining reserve of strength in his exhausted body. When dawn broke at last, gray light creeping faintly into the cave through the space where the boulder had been shifted just enough to let the flocks pass, and the rams grew restless to reach their pasture, Odysseus, hidden beneath the belly of his chosen ram, his fingers aching from the strength of his grip, his whole body pressed flat against the animal's underside so that not even the tip of a sandal might betray him, listened as Polyphemus, still blind and still groping, felt along the back of each animal as it passed him at the cave's entrance, checking for any rider that might be attempting to escape astride the sheep's back, but never once thinking to check the animal's undersides, where his prisoners hung concealed. When the great ram carrying Odysseus himself came last of all, moving more slowly under its unaccustomed burden, Polyphemus paused and spoke to it directly, his voice heavy now with grief rather than fury. "Dear ram," he said, resting his hand upon the animal's back. "Why do you leave the cave last today, you who are always first among my flock to reach the meadow? Do you grieve, as I grieve, for your master's eye, put out by a wicked man and his accursed companions, a man called Nobody, who I still hope has not yet escaped his death? If only you could speak and tell me where he hides, that I might dash his brains upon the cave floor and ease at least a portion of the suffering that Nobody has caused me." Odysseus, pressed against the animal's warm belly, scarcely dared to breathe as the blind giant's hand rested so near to where he clung, and it was several agonizing moments before Polyphemus released the ram and let it pass through the entrance into the morning light, still entirely unaware that the very man who had blinded him rode hidden beneath its wool. Once safely beyond the cave and clear of the giant's reach, Odysseus released his hold and helped free his remaining companions, and together, driving a portion of the giant's own flock before them as they went, they hurried back toward the ship where the rest of the crew waited in fearful anticipation, their relief at seeing their captain and companions alive tempered immediately by grief at how few of their number had survived the ordeal. They loaded the stolen sheep aboard, pushed off from that terrible shore, and rowed hard for open water. But it was here, at the very edge of safety, that Odysseus made the decision that would prove the single most costly mistake of his entire journey. Once they had put sufficient distance between themselves and the shore, close enough still that his voice might carry but far enough, he believed, to remain beyond any danger, Odysseus could not resist calling back toward the cave, taunting the blinded giant with news that no mere nobody, but a mortal man with a name and a homeland, had defeated him. "Cyclops," he shouted across the water, cupping his hands around his mouth, "if any mortal man should ever ask who blinded you and shamed your eye, tell him it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, who makes his home in Ithaca." The effect of those proud words was immediate and terrible. Polyphemus, hearing his enemy's true name at last, tore a great peak from the hillside above his cave and hurled it toward the sound of Odysseus's voice with all the strength his fury could summon. The massive rock crashed into the sea just ahead of the ship's prow, raising a wave so enormous that it very nearly drove the vessel back onto the very shore they had just escaped, and only desperate rowing kept them from disaster. And then, lifting his sightless face toward the heavens, Polyphemus called out a prayer that would shape the whole of the years still to come. "Hear me, Poseidon, shaker of the earth, blue-haired lord of the sea," the giant cried. "If I am truly your son, as my mother always told me, grant that Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, whose home is Ithaca, may never reach that home again. But if it is decreed that he must see his family and his native land once more, let him arrive late, and stripped of all his companions, in a ship not his own, and let him find only trouble waiting for him in his own house." "I did not know it then," Odysseus admitted quietly to the listening court. "But that prayer, spoken by a blinded giant into an indifferent sky, was heard, and it was answered. Poseidon, whom I had already wronged years before through no choice of my own, in a manner this hall need not concern itself with tonight, took up his son's curse as his own personal vendetta from that day forward, and everything that befell me in the long years since, every storm, every wreck, every companion I lost to the hungry sea, can be traced back to that single moment of pride. When I could not resist the temptation to boast my own name to an enemy, I should have simply left blind and raging behind me on that shore. It is a lesson I have paid for 1,000 times over in the years since, and I confess I am not yet certain I have fully learned it even now." We rode on in grim silence after that, he told them, our small fleet reunited beyond the Cyclops' shore, and mourning yet again those companions who would never see their homes, before the winds carried us onward to an island unlike any other we encountered in all our wanderings, a floating island surrounded entirely by a wall of solid bronze, its cliffs rising sheer and smooth from the water. This was the home of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, a favorite of the gods, who lived there with his wife and their 12 children, 6 sons and 6 daughters, married to one another in pairs, and settled into a life of continuous, harmonious feasting that never seemed to grow tiresome to any of them. Aeolus welcomed the shipwrecked travelers with genuine warmth, hosting them for an entire month in his palace, a hall filled with the constant sound of flutes and lyres, its walls hung with fine bronze ornaments, its tables never once left bare of roasted meat and sweet cakes throughout the whole of their stay. For Aeolus and his family, blessed as they were with an existence of unbroken ease, seemed to delight in nothing so much as sharing their abundance with guests who could bring them fresh stories from the wider world beyond their floating shores. He asked Odysseus again and again to recount the story of the war at Troy and the misfortunes that had befallen the Greek fleet since. Listening with evident fascination to every detail, his sons and daughters gathered close around the fire late into the night to hear each new telling. When at last Odysseus asked leave to continue his journey home, Aeolus granted it gladly and offered, as a parting gift, something no ordinary king could have provided: a great ox-hide bag in which he had bound the force of every contrary wind that might otherwise blow a ship off its course, leaving only a single gentle western breeze free to carry Odysseus and his fleet steadily and directly toward Ithaca. He tied that bag shut with a silver cord, Odysseus said, and warned me most sternly never to loosen it until I had reached my own harbor, for within it were bound winds capable of tearing a fleet apart should they ever be released together at sea. I took his gift with deep gratitude, secured it myself within my own ship, and for 9 full days and nights afterward, that single gentle breeze carried us steadily onward, until at last, on the 10th day, I could see the watchfires burning upon the hills of my own Ithaca, so close that I believed, for the first time in 10 years, that my long ordeal was truly and finally about to end. It was at this very moment of hope, exhausted after 9 days of personally tending the ship's course without rest, that Odysseus allowed himself, at last, to sleep. And it was this single moment of understandable human weakness that undid everything. While he slept, his own men, who had watched him carry that mysterious bag so carefully and so possessively throughout the entire voyage, fell to whispering among themselves, convinced that it must contain some private treasure, gold or silver given by Aeolus that Odysseus intended to keep entirely for himself rather than share fairly among the crew, who had suffered every bit as much as he had. "Here we are," one of them muttered to the others, encouraged by their captain's exhausted sleep, "about to return home after so many hardships, honored everywhere we go, welcomed and gifted by every king we meet, while our own captain hoards whatever treasure Aeolus gave him and shares nothing with the rest of us who have suffered every misfortune right alongside him. Let us see what is inside that bag." Persuaded by their own resentment and curiosity, the men loosened the silver cord while Odysseus slept, and every contrary wind Aeolus had so carefully bound within immediately burst free at once. A howling, chaotic gale that seized the entire fleet and drove it backward across the very distance it had taken 9 hard days to cross, all the way back to Aeolus's floating island, undoing in a single terrible night everything that 9 days of careful sailing had accomplished. Odysseus woke to the chaos of that sudden storm and, realizing at once what had happened, was seized by a despair so complete that he considered, for a moment, simply casting himself into the sea rather than face his men or endure the return of every hardship he believed he had finally left behind. But he mastered himself, endured the storm as he had endured every other, and found himself once again standing before Aeolus's gates, his fleet battered and his pride considerably diminished. This time, however, Aeolus's welcome had curdled entirely into suspicion and refusal. "Get out of my island at once," the Wind King told him, his earlier warmth entirely gone. "For surely no man is more cursed by the gods than you, that you should return here in such disgrace after I sent you off with every advantage a host could offer. I will not help a man the gods themselves have clearly marked for suffering, lest their displeasure fall upon my own house as well." And with that, Odysseus and his crew were sent away without further aid, forced now to row rather than sail, their fleet's oars their only remaining means of propulsion across a sea that seemed, more and more, determined to keep them from ever reaching home. 6 days and 6 nights they rowed after that, exhausted and disheartened, until on the 7th day they came upon a harbor unlike any they had yet seen, a deep, sheltered inlet ringed by steep cliffs on every side, so calm within its walls that not even the smallest wave disturbed its surface, a stillness that should have felt like a blessing after so much storm, but which struck Odysseus instead, from the very first moment, as unnatural and unsettling. Tall cliffs of pale stone rose sheer on either side of the narrow entrance, so close together that a man might almost believe the harbor had been carved deliberately, like a trap built to swallow ships whole, and no birds called from the heights above, no goats grazed upon the slopes. Nothing moved at all except the ships themselves gliding into that unervingly perfect calm. Something in that silence troubled me, he admitted, though I could not have said exactly what. I ordered my own ship to remain moored just outside the harbor's narrow entrance, tied to a rock at the base of the cliffs, while the rest of my fleet sailed on inside to shelter within that too still water. He sent 3 men ashore to learn what people lived in this country, and it was not long before those scouts encountered a girl of extraordinary size drawing water at a spring near the town, who directed them, when questioned, to the hall of her father, the king. What they found there was not the ordinary hospitality of a mortal household, but the wife of the king herself, a woman of monstrous size, who summoned her husband home from the town assembly the moment she laid eyes on the strangers. The king, when he arrived, seized one of the 3 scouts immediately and began to prepare him for his supper, while the other 2 fled in terror back toward the harbor, screaming warnings as they ran. These were the Laestrygonians, a race of cannibal giants far more numerous and far more terrible in their coordinated savagery than even the solitary Polyphemus had been, and the alarm raised by the fleeing scouts brought them pouring down from the cliffs above the harbor in overwhelming numbers, hurling boulders down onto the ships trapped below with devastating, practiced accuracy. Boulders large enough to shatter a ship's hull with a single strike, while others speared the struggling, drowning sailors like men spearing fish from a riverbank, showing no mercy whatsoever to a fleet that had sailed unknowingly into a trap it could never have anticipated. I watched from outside the harbor's mouth, Odysseus said, his voice dropping low with a grief that had clearly never fully healed, as ship after ship of my fleet was crushed and sunk within that narrow inlet. My own companions, men who had survived Troy itself and the horror of the Cyclops' cave, dying now in a harbor that had seemed, only an hour before, the calmest and safest anchorage we had found in all our wanderings. There was nothing I could do to save them, moored as I was outside the harbor's mouth. I could only draw my sword, cut the mooring rope binding my own ship to the rock, and order my remaining crew to row for open water with every last reserve of strength they possessed, while behind us the giants continued their slaughter until not a single other ship of our fleet remained afloat. Of the 12 ships that had sailed from Troy together, only Odysseus's own vessel escaped that harbor. The rest, along with every man who had sailed aboard them, lost entirely to the Laestrygonians' terrible ambush. It was a grief, he confessed, heavier than almost any other loss of the entire voyage, for it was not simply a handful of companions taken by a single monster in a single cave, but the near total destruction of everything and everyone he had set out from Troy with, reducing his once proud fleet of 12 ships to a single battered vessel and its exhausted, grieving crew. They sailed on after that in a silence heavier than any storm, he told the hull, grief pressing down upon every man aboard, until they came at last to a wooded island rising green and quiet from the sea, its shoreline thick with oak and poplar, its interior wrapped in a stillness so complete that even the birds seemed to move without sound through its branches. For 2 full days and nights after landing, Odysseus said, his men did nothing but lie exhausted upon the sand, too grieved and too weary even to explore the land they had washed up on, the memory of the Laestrygonians' harbor still raw and terrible behind their eyes. And it was only on the 3rd morning, hunger finally overcoming sorrow, that Odysseus rose and climbed alone to a high point on the island to survey the land, and from there he glimpsed, far off through the trees, a thin column of smoke rising from what appeared to be a dwelling of some kind, evidence that this quiet, unervingly still island was not, in fact, uninhabited. Dividing his remaining crew into 2 companies, he cast lots to determine who would explore this smoke source, and the lot fell to a company led by a man named Eurylochus, a kinsman of Odysseus's own and a cautious, level-headed man whose instincts, as events would soon prove, deserved far more trust than they were given. Eurylochus led his 22 companions inland through the silent forest until they came upon a magnificent palace of dressed stone, standing alone in a broad clearing and gathered around its entrance. Remarkably, were mountain wolves and lions, creatures that ought by every natural instinct to have torn the approaching strangers apart on sight. Instead, these beasts approached the frightened sailors with an eerie, unnatural gentleness, nuzzling against them and wagging their tails like hounds greeting a beloved master returning home, an unsettling wrongness that should have warned every man present to turn back at once. From within the palace came the sound of a woman singing, a voice of such extraordinary beauty that it drew the men forward almost against their own will, and calling out at the entrance, they were answered by the singer herself, who emerged and invited them inside with every appearance of gracious, generous hospitality. This was Circe, a goddess and a sorceress of formidable power, said to be sister to the very witch who ruled the deadly straits Odysseus would encounter later still, and she welcomed all of Eurylochus' men inside her hall, save Eurylochus himself, who, suspicious of the whole unnatural scene from the very beginning, chose to remain hidden outside and watch rather than cross her threshold. It was fortunate that he did. Circe seated the men at her table, offered them a rich meal mixed with wine, and blended into their food a certain drug of her own devising. And the moment they had eaten and drunk their fill, she struck each man in turn with her wand, and one by one, in horrifying succession, they were transformed entirely into swine, their bodies coarsening into bristled hide, their voices reduced to the frightened squealing of pigs, though their minds, cruelly, remained entirely human, trapped now within bodies they could no longer control, pinned like ordinary livestock while Circe tossed them acorns and cornel berries to eat, exactly as one would feed any common pig. Eurylochus, watching this transformation unfold from his hiding place outside, fled back through the forest in horror to report what he had witnessed to Odysseus, so shaken by what he had seen that he could barely force the words out coherently. And though he begged Odysseus not to attempt any rescue, insisting that to do so was to walk willingly into the very same fate that had befallen the others, Odysseus, hearing that his men remained trapped and transformed within that palace, could not simply abandon them, whatever the danger to himself. I set out alone through that silent forest, Odysseus told the listening court, with only my sword at my side, and it was there, in the deepest part of that unnatural wood, that I encountered a young man of striking beauty, his first beard just beginning to show upon his chin, who took my hand and revealed himself, in that same moment, to be Hermes, messenger of the gods, sent by some providence I had not asked for to warn and protect me before I walked into a trap that had already claimed so many of my companions. "Where are you going, unlucky man?" Hermes asked him. "Wandering alone through these hills, ignorant of this country, to rescue companions who are now pinned like swine within Circe's house. I tell you plainly, you will not free them, and you yourself will remain there among them, transformed as they were transformed. But I will help you and save you from this danger. Here." And the god bent down and drew from the earth a certain herb, showing it to Odysseus so that he might recognize it, a plant with a black root and a flower as white as milk, which the gods called moly, a plant so difficult and dangerous for mortal hands to dig from the earth that only a god could safely provide it. "Take this," Hermes told him, "and when Circe mixes her drug into your food and strikes you afterward with her wand, this herb will render her magic powerless against you. And when she realizes her spell has failed and grows afraid and invites you instead to her bed, you must not refuse her, so that she will free your companions and treat you well in her house. But first make her swear, by the great oath the gods themselves consider unbreakable, that she intends you no further harm, lest she use the moment of your vulnerability to strip you of your courage and your manhood entirely, as she has done to lesser men before you." Armed with this protection, Odysseus continued on to Circe's palace exactly as his men had done before him, and found the same eerie welcome, the same unnaturally gentle wolves and lions, the same beautiful singing voice drawing him toward her open door. Circe welcomed him inside, seated him at her table, and served him the same drugged wine and food she had served his companions. And when he had eaten and drunk exactly as expected, She struck him with her wand and commanded him, in the same words she had used on all the others, to go and join his fellow swine in the pen outside. But the moly Hermes had given him held true, and rather than transforming, Odysseus rose from his seat and drew his sword, rushing toward her as though he meant to kill her where she stood. Circe, seeing her magic fail for the first time perhaps in longer than she could remember, cried out in genuine astonishment and fear and fell to her knees before him, clasping his legs in the very posture of a suppliant. "Who are you?" she asked, "that my drugs have no power over you?" No other man has ever withstood this enchantment once it passed his lips. Surely you must be Odysseus himself, the man of many wiles, of whom Hermes has long told me I should expect, sailing home at last from Troy. Come, sheathe your sword, and let us go to my bed together, that trusting one another there, we might come to know each other's hearts. Circe, Odysseus answered, remembering Hermes's careful warning. How can you ask me to be gentle with you, when it is you who turn my companions into swine within this very hall, and now, holding me here yourself, invite me to your bed only, I suspect, to strip me of my courage and my manhood once I lie there defenseless? I will not go to your bed at all unless you consent to swear a great oath that you intend no further harm against me. Circe swore the oath exactly as he demanded, and true to her word, once the oath was given, she led him to her bed, and afterward called her serving nymphs to prepare a bath for him and set out a feast. And it was only when Odysseus, sitting sullen and untouched before this feast, refused to eat, that Circe, noticing his continued grief, finally asked him directly what troubled him so deeply that he would not touch even her finest hospitality. Circe, he answered, what man of any conscience could bring himself to taste food or drink before his own companions were freed and standing again before his eyes? If you truly wish me to eat, then free my men, that I might see them with my own eyes. Circe went out at once and drove the transformed swine from their pen into the hall, anointing each one with a different charm, and before Odysseus's eyes, the bristles fell away, the swinish forms melted back into human shape, and his companions stood before him once more as men, younger and more handsome, if anything, than they had been before their transformation, weeping with joy and disbelief at their sudden restoration, embracing Odysseus and one another with a relief so overwhelming that even Circe herself, watching the reunion, was said to have been moved by the sight of it. Circe insisted, then, that the rest of the crew waiting still upon the ship be brought ashore as well, and when Eurylochus, still shaken and suspicious even after hearing of his companion's restoration, warned the others not to trust this sorceress's hospitality a second time, it was only Odysseus's own patient insistence that finally persuaded the last of his frightened men to leave the ship and join their restored companions within Circe's hall. What followed was a full year of rest and recovery unlike anything the crew had known since leaving Troy, a slow, healing season of feasting and comfort upon that quiet island, Circe's table always overflowing with meat and bread and wine, her hospitality now as genuine and generous as it had once been treacherous. We stayed a full year in that place, Odysseus told the hall, and I will not pretend the rest was unwelcome, for we had endured losses enough by then to make any respite feel like a mercy from the gods. But even as the wine flowed and our strength slowly returned, I could feel, beneath the comfort, the same old ache that had never truly left me even during my longest years of captivity elsewhere. My men felt it too, though none of us spoke of it openly for many months, each reluctant, perhaps, to disturb a peace we all secretly feared might be our last. It was, in the end, his own companions who first gave voice to what they had all been quietly feeling, drawing Odysseus aside one evening to remind him, gently but firmly, that whatever comfort this island offered, it was not their home, and that a year was surely long enough for any man to have rested from his hardships. Odysseus went that same night to Circe and asked her, at last, to make good on the promise she had once given him, to help him find his way home to Ithaca. Circe, though she might once have wished to keep so remarkable a guest beside her forever, did not resist his request, for she understood, perhaps better than anyone, exactly what kind of man she was releasing, and exactly how little peace he would ever find so long as his home remained beyond his reach. "You need not remain unwillingly in my house any longer," she told him. "But there is one more journey you must undertake before you can safely find your way back across the sea to your own shores. A journey stranger and more difficult than any you have yet faced, for I fear it, even after my long years of divine knowledge, more than nearly any other place a mortal man might travel." "Where must I go?" Odysseus asked her, though something in her voice had already filled him with a dread deeper than any storm or monster had yet inspired. "You must sail," Circe told him, "to the house of Hades and dread Persephone, to consult the shade of the blind prophet Tiresias, whose mind alone, among all the dead, remains whole and unclouded, granted by Persephone herself the gift of continued understanding even in death, so that he alone among the shades can offer you true counsel about the road that still lies ahead of you. No living man has ever sailed there and returned, but I will tell you the course and what you must do when you arrive, that you might survive what other men have never attempted." And so it was that Odysseus and his remaining crew, their year of rest at last behind them, loaded their ship once more and set their course not toward home, as every man aboard longed to do, but toward the very edge of the world Circe had described to them, a place where the sun itself did not shine, where the ordinary boundary between the living and the dead grew thin enough for a mortal man to cross, if he dared, and return. "We sailed for a full day and night," Odysseus said, his voice growing quieter now, "carried by a following wind Circe herself had sent to speed us on our way, until the sun sank at last and did not rise again as it should have, and we found ourselves gliding through a darkness unlike any night I had ever known, a permanent twilight where no sun's rays could reach, at the very edge of a country called the land of the Cimmerians, wrapped forever in cloud and mist, a fitting threshold, I thought, even then, for the country we were about to enter. The sea itself seemed to change beneath their hull as they went," he told the hull, growing heavier and darker, its surface untouched by any wind though the ship still moved steadily onward, and a cold crept into the air that had nothing to do with any ordinary season, settling into the bones of every man aboard until even the boldest among them fell silent, none daring to speak into that oppressive, waiting stillness. Following Circe's careful instructions exactly, they beached their ship at last upon that shadowed shore, and Odysseus walked forward alone to the place she had described, where two rivers of the underworld met at a single rock, and there he dug a trench as wide as a man's forearm is long, and poured into it offerings to the dead, first honeyed milk, then sweet wine, then water, and over all of it scattered white barley, praying as he did so to the powerless dead, promising rich sacrifices upon his return to Ithaca in their honor. Then, drawing his sword, he cut the throat of a black ram and a black ewe he had carried for exactly this purpose, letting their dark blood pour down into the trench he had dug, exactly as Circe had instructed. And it was then, Odysseus told the silent, listening hull, every face in that firelit court turned toward him now with an attention that had not wavered once since he began his tale, that the dead came. They rose up from the darkness around him in a great, shifting multitude, drawn by the scent of blood pooling in the trench he had dug, brides and unmarried youths and old men who had suffered greatly in their long lives, and tender young girls still grieving the loss of futures they had never lived to see, and soldiers still bearing the wounds that had killed them in battle, their armor stained with blood that had never washed away even in death, all of them crowding forward from every direction with a strange, dry rustling sound, like the whisper of dead leaves stirred by an autumn wind, calling out with voices that carried no breath behind them, pressing close around the dark pool of blood in a silent, desperate hunger that Odysseus said he felt in his own bones before he ever understood its cause. He gripped his sword tightly across his knees, exactly as Circe had warned him he must, refusing to let a single shade approach the blood before the one soul he had come so far to find. And it was there, at the very edge of the world, surrounded on every side by the countless whispering dead, that Odysseus fell silent for a moment before his listeners, and the fire in the great hall of the Phaeacians burned low, and every man and woman present leaned forward into that silence, waiting, as we ourselves must now wait, to learn what the shadows gathering before him were about to reveal. The first shade to approach him was not one Odysseus had expected, nor one he had traveled so far and so strangely to find. It was the spirit of Elpenor, youngest of his crew, a man neither particularly brave in battle nor especially skilled with an oar, but beloved nonetheless for a certain easy good humor that had lightened many a hard night at sea. I had not even known he was dead, Odysseus confessed to the listening hall, his voice catching slightly on the memory. In our haste to leave Circe's island, no one had thought to wake him from where he lay sleeping upon her rooftop, having climbed there the night before to escape the heat of the hall below, heavy with wine and unaccustomed to the height. When the ship's crew called out to depart, he woke in confusion, forgot entirely where he was, and stepping toward what he thought was the stairway down, walked instead straight off the roof's edge, breaking his neck upon the stones below, his spirit descending to this shadowed country even before my own ship had cleared the harbor. Elpenor's shade wept before him now, or made the sound of weeping, for the dead, Odysseus explained, could summon no true tears, only the memory and gesture of grief. Odysseus, the shade said, his voice thin and distant as wind through a cracked door, do not sail on and abandon me unburied and unwept upon that island, lest I become a curse upon you before the gods. Burn my body with whatever armor I possessed, raise a mound for me upon the shore, and set upon it the oar I pulled in life, that men still living might know, in years to come, of an unlucky man who once sailed these waters. Odysseus promised he would do exactly as the shade requested, and it is worth noting, he told his listeners, that this promise, given so readily and so easily in the strange twilight of that place, would prove one of the very few promises of his entire voyage that cost him nothing at all to keep, and grief made keeping it a duty he welcomed rather than resented. He held his sword still across his knees after Elpenor's shade withdrew, refusing the crowding, whispering multitude of dead who pressed closer with every passing moment, mothers reaching toward him with hollow, pleading eyes, warriors he had known at Troy drifting past with wounds still gaping upon their translucent forms, until at last the shade he had truly sailed to this dreadful shore to find came forward through the gathered dark, carrying a golden staff, moving with a dignity and purpose that set him apart from every other drifting, aimless spirit in that whole gray country, and Odysseus recognized him at once from descriptions given by men who had known him living. Tiresias of Thebes, blind in life as in death, but granted by the goddess Persephone the singular gift of a mind that remained whole and clear even among the forgetful, wandering shades around him. Man of hardship, the prophet said, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the restless dead pressing all around them. Why have you left the light of the sun to come here and look upon the dead in this joyless place? Step back from the trench and sheathe your sword, that I might drink of the blood you have offered and speak to you the truth. Desperate hunger that Odysseus said he felt in his own bones before he ever understood its cause. He gripped his sword tightly across his knees, exactly as Circe had warned him he must, refusing to let a single shade approach the blood before the one soul he had come so far to find. And it was there, at the very edge of the world, surrounded on every side by the countless whispering dead, that Odysseus fell silent for a moment before his listeners, and the fire in the great hall of the Phaeacians burned low, and every man and woman present leaned forward into that silence, waiting, as we ourselves must now wait, to learn what the shadows gathering before him were about to reveal. The first shade to approach him was not one Odysseus had expected, nor one he had traveled so far and so strangely to find. It was the spirit of Elpenor, youngest of his crew, a man neither particularly brave in battle nor especially skilled with an oar, but beloved nonetheless for a certain easy good humor that had lightened many a hard night at sea. I had not even known he was dead, Odysseus confessed to the listening hall, his voice catching slightly on the memory. In our haste to leave Circe's island, no one had thought to wake him from where he lay sleeping upon her rooftop, having climbed there the night before to escape the heat of the hall below, heavy with wine and unaccustomed to the height. When the ship's crew called out to depart, he woke in confusion, forgot entirely where he was, and stepping toward what he thought was the stairway down, walked instead straight off the roof's edge, breaking his neck upon the stones below, his spirit descending to this shadowed country even before my own ship had cleared the harbor. Elpenor's shade wept before him now, or made the sound of weeping, for the dead, Odysseus explained, could summon no true tears, only the memory and gesture of grief. Odysseus, the shade said, his voice thin and distant as wind through a cracked door, do not sail on and abandon me unburied and unwept upon that island, lest I become a curse upon you before the gods. Burn my body with whatever armor I possessed, raise a mound for me upon the shore, and set upon it the oar I pulled in life, that men still living might know, in years to come, of an unlucky man who once sailed these waters. Odysseus promised he would do exactly as the shade requested, and it is worth noting, he told his listeners, that this promise, given so readily and so easily in the strange twilight of that place, would prove one of the very few promises of his entire voyage that cost him nothing at all to keep, and grief made keeping it a duty he welcomed rather than resented. He held his sword still across his knees after Elpenor's shade withdrew, refusing the crowding, whispering multitude of dead who pressed closer with every passing moment, mothers reaching toward him with hollow, pleading eyes, warriors he had known at Troy drifting past with wounds still gaping upon their translucent forms, until at last the shade he had truly sailed to this dreadful shore to find came forward through the gathered dark, carrying a golden staff, moving with a dignity and purpose that set him apart from every other drifting, aimless spirit in that whole gray country, and Odysseus recognized him at once from descriptions given by men who had known him living. Tiresias of Thebes, blind in life as in death, but granted by the goddess Persephone the singular gift of a mind that remained whole and clear even among the forgetful, wandering shades around him. Man of hardship, the prophet said, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the restless dead pressing all around them. Why have you left the light of the sun to come here and look upon the dead in this joyless place? Step back from the trench and sheathe your sword, that I might drink of the blood you have offered and speak to you the truth. Odysseus obeyed, and Tiresias drank, and when he had drunk, his words came clear and unhesitating, carrying the weight of foreknowledge no living man could claim. You seek a sweet return home, glorious Odysseus, the prophet said, but the god of the sea holds a grudge against you still, in his heart in rage for the eye you took from his own son. Yet even so, you and your men may yet reach home, though not without suffering more, if only you can master your own desire, and the desires of your companions. When your ship reaches the island of Thrinacia, where the cattle and fat sheep of Helios, the sun god who sees and hears all things, graze upon that sacred pasture. Leave those animals unharmed. Keep your mind only on your homeward journey, and you may yet reach Ithaca, though late, and in suffering, and in a ship not your own, finding trouble waiting in your own house besides. But if you harm those cattle, I foretell ruin for your ship and for your men, and though you yourself may escape, you will come home in another man's vessel, alone. And you will find, waiting at home, insolent men eating away your household substance, wooing your godlike wife with gifts, men you will have to kill within your own halls before your suffering finally ends, whether by open force or by cunning. Odysseus, hearing this grim foretelling, could not help but ask the question that had gnawed at him since he first understood the prophet could see the whole shape of his future. Tiresias, he said, this you have spoken, the gods themselves must have woven already into the pattern of things. But tell me this besides. I see here the shade of my own mother, sitting silent near the blood, unable or unwilling to look upon her own son or speak a single word to him. How might I make her know me? That is simply told, Tiresias answered. Whichever of the dead you allow to approach the blood will speak truth to you, and whichever you deny it will withdraw again in silence. And with that, having delivered his prophecy and his answer both, the shade of the blind seer withdrew back into the deeper dark, his part in the story finished, leaving Odysseus alone once more before the trench, with his own mother's spirit still waiting, silent and unrecognizing, only a few steps away. He let her approach the blood then, and she drank, and the moment the dark liquid touched whatever remained of her, recognition flooded into her hollow eyes, and she knew him at once for her son. "My child," she said, her voice trembling with a longing that pierced Odysseus. He confessed, more deeply than any wound he had taken at Troy, "How have you come here living, beneath this darkness, when it is so hard for living eyes to look upon these things? Is it so long since you left Troy that you have only now completed your wandering home, and not yet seen Ithaca, nor your own wife within your halls?" Odysseus, his own voice unsteady now as he answered, explained to her the whole long chain of misfortune that had kept him from home, and then, unable to hold back the question that mattered more to him than any prophecy, asked after everything he had left behind. "Tell me of my father and of my son, whether the honor that was once mine still rests with them, or whether some other man has taken it, believing me lost forever. And tell me of my wife. Tell me her mind and her purpose. Does she remain beside our son, guarding all as it was? Or has she already married the best man among the Achaeans?" "She remains," his mother told him, and something in Odysseus's chest, he admitted, seemed to loosen at those two words in a way nothing else in this whole dark country had managed. "She remains in your own halls still, enduring, though her days and nights are worn away in grief and weeping. No man has yet taken your honor from Telemachus, who governs the estates and shares fairly in the feasts, as befits a man rendering judgment, for all men invite him. But your father remains out in the countryside, no longer coming to the city, sleeping in winter where the servants sleep, in ashes near the fire, clothed poorly, and when summer comes he lies wherever leaves have fallen in his orchard, grieving always, his sorrow growing heavier with the passing years, for you. And I myself," she continued, her voice growing fainter now, "died of nothing else but longing for you, my shining sun, and for your gentleness and kindness, which is what took the sweet life from me." Odysseus, hearing this, reached out 3 times to embrace his mother's shade, longing to hold her as he might have in life. And 3 times she slipped through his arms like a shadow or a dream, weightless and impossible to grasp, leaving him to cry out in a grief and frustration that, he confessed, very nearly undid him entirely before the assembled court of listening Phaeacians. "Why do you slip from me, mother?" he asked her, "when I would hold you even here, that we might take some comfort together, even in this cold place, from our shared grief? Or is this merely some phantom sent by dread Persephone, to make me grieve still more?" "This is simply the way of mortals once they die," she told him gently. "The sinews no longer hold flesh and bone together, and the body's strength is consumed by the fire's blazing power. Once the spirit has left the white bones behind, and the soul flies off like a dream and hovers hereafter. But return now, quickly, to the light, and remember all you have seen, that you may tell it, in time, to your own wife." While they spoke, other shades had gathered nearby, waiting their turn, and among them Odysseus recognized a figure whose fate struck him with a particular horror, for this was Agamemnon himself, commander of the entire Greek expedition against Troy, the very king who had led them all to victory only to meet, it now seemed, an end far crueler than any he had faced upon that 10-year battlefield. "Agamemnon," Odysseus said, "what death brought you down, that laid you low? Did Poseidon rouse some terrible wind and wreck your ships? Or did hostile men cut you down on land, while you were seizing cattle or fine flocks, or fighting over some besieged city, or its women?" Agamemnon's shade answered with a bitterness that seemed to reach even beyond the grave. "Odysseus," he said, "I was not brought down by Poseidon's storms, nor by enemies in open battle. My own wife, together with the man she took as her lover in my long absence, murdered me in my own hall, at my own table, on the very day of my homecoming, when I believed my trials finally at their end. They struck me down as one slaughters an ox at its manger, while around me my companions were cut down like swine at a rich man's wedding feast. And among all the terrible sights I witnessed at Troy, none struck me with such pity as the cries of Cassandra, whom I had brought home with me as a captive, murdered across my very body by that same treacherous wife, while I, dying, could not so much as raise a hand to defend her." The shade's warning that followed struck Odysseus with a chill he said he had not fully shaken even now, so many years later, telling the tale before the Phaeacian court. "Be on your guard, even you, when you return home at last, Agamemnon told him. Do not trust a woman entirely, even your own wife, and do not tell her all that is in your mind, but reveal a portion and keep a portion hidden. Yet I do not believe your own wife will ever plot such murder against you, Odysseus, for Penelope is a woman of far too much sense and virtue for such treachery. She was still a young bride, with an infant at her breast, when we left for Troy together, and I do not doubt she remains faithful still. But even so, do not make your homecoming too public a thing. Land upon your own shores in secrecy, for there is no longer any trusting in women, not entirely, not after what I myself endured. It was not long after this exchange that another shade approached, and this one, Odysseus admitted, he had both longed and dreaded to see above almost any other spirit in that whole gathered multitude. For it was Achilles, greatest of all the warriors who had fought at Troy, the man whose fury and grief had shaped so much of that terrible war. Odysseus, Achilles said, recognizing him at once, what greater deed remains for you to plan, that you dare descend to Hades, where the senseless dead dwell on, mere shadows of the men who once lived? And then, before Odysseus could answer, the great warrior's shade continued, his voice heavy with a longing that startled Odysseus deeply, coming as it did from a man who had, in life, seemed to want nothing more than glory and a hero's death. Do not try to console me for dying, glorious Odysseus. I would rather work the soil as a hired servant for some landless man barely scraping a living, than rule as king over all the perished dead. Odysseus, moved by this confession from the very man whose choice of a short, glorious life over a long, forgotten one had once seemed the noblest decision any hero could make, found himself offering what comfort he could, telling Achilles of his son Neoptolemus, how bravely the young man had fought in the final year at Troy, how wise his counsel in the war councils, how he had been among the very warriors chosen to hide within the wooden horse, showing no fear even as lesser men wept and trembled in that hollow darkness, waiting for the signal to spring forth and end the long siege at last. Hearing this account of his son's courage, Achilles' shade, alone among all the dead Odysseus encountered that day, seemed to walk away with something like satisfaction, striding off across the fields of asphodel with long steps. Rejoicing, Odysseus said that his own son had proven himself preeminent among men, even if the father himself could take no further part in a world of the living he had left so long behind. Only one shade among all he encountered that day refused, entirely, to speak with him. This was Ajax, a warrior second only to Achilles himself in strength among all the Greeks at Troy, who had taken his own life in a fit of shame and madness after losing a contest over Achilles' armor to Odysseus' own claim, a bitter rivalry that had ended, in Ajax's case, in suicide rather than surrender. His shade stood apart from the others, silent, still burning, it seemed, with the same wounded pride that had destroyed him in life, and though Odysseus called out to him, begging him to set aside his anger even now, in death, when surely such grievances no longer mattered, Ajax turned away without a word and withdrew into the deeper darkness among the other silent dead, refusing even this small reconciliation. I would have given a great deal, in that moment, Odysseus admitted quietly to the Phaeacian hall, to hear even a single word of forgiveness from that proud, silent shade, for I never wished the contest between us to end in his death, and his silence, more than almost anything else I witnessed in that whole shadowed country, has stayed with me every day since. Many other shades pressed forward after this, kings and queens of ancient legend, women who had loved gods and borne their children, warriors whose stories Odysseus recounted only briefly to his listeners. He glimpsed, among the throng, the shade of Minos, once king of Crete, seated now as a judge among the dead, rendering verdicts upon the crowding shadows exactly as he had once rendered judgments among the living. He saw the mighty hunter Orion, driving before him across the fields of asphodel the ghostly forms of beasts he had slain in life, and he saw Tantalus, standing in a pool of water that receded the moment he bent to drink, beneath branches of fruit that lifted away from his grasping hands the instant he reached for them, condemned to eternal thirst and eternal hunger in punishment for offenses against the gods themselves. He saw Sisyphus too, straining with his whole body against an enormous boulder, forcing it with tremendous effort up the slope of a hill, only to watch it roll back down again the moment it neared the crest, a labor without end or purpose, repeated endlessly through all the ages of the world. I could have stayed and watched these punishments and these judgments for a very long while, Odysseus admitted. So strange and so terrible was the whole sight of it. But the press of the dead grew thicker with every passing moment, and a fear took hold of me that Persephone herself might send up some monstrous shade from deeper still within that realm, some horror even my own hardened courage could not face. And so, before that fear could take fuller root, Odysseus called his remaining companions back to the ship, and they rowed swiftly away from that shadowed shore, back across the dark water toward the world of living light, carrying with them the weight of everything the dead had told them. The current itself seemed to know their intention, carrying them swiftly back across the river of ocean and out into open water, until at last the familiar shore of Circe's island rose again before them. And there, before doing anything else at all, Odysseus led his men to the place where Elpenor's body still lay exactly where it had fallen, unburned and unburied. And true to the promise he had made to that unhappy shade, they built a great pyre upon the shore, burned the body along with his armor, raised a mound of earth above the ashes, and set into its summit the oar Elpenor had once pulled in life, exactly as he had asked, weeping as they worked, for even a man who had died so foolishly, tumbling from a rooftop in a haze of wine, deserved to be mourned and remembered properly by the companions he left behind. Circe herself came down to the shore as they completed these final rites, bringing with her serving women who carried bread and meat and dark wine, and she did not ask, this time, for any long account of what they had witnessed in the land of the dead, seeming already to know, through whatever divine knowledge was hers to command, exactly where they had been and what they had learned there. Reckless men, she said, though not unkindly, who have gone down alive into the house of Hades, and so will die twice over, when other men die only once. Come, eat and drink here upon this shore through the rest of this day, and when dawn comes, I will show you the course you must sail, and tell you of every danger along that course, that you might avoid, through knowledge rather than blind chance, at least a portion of the suffering that would otherwise destroy you. That night, once the crew had eaten their fill and Odysseus had drawn her aside from the others, Circe gave him the warnings that would shape everything still to come, speaking with the grave, unhurried care of someone determined to make certain nothing was lost in the telling. First, she told him, you will come to the sirens, who enchant any man who sails too near them, singing a song so beautiful that he forgets entirely his home, his family, and his purpose, remaining transfixed upon their meadow until he wastes away and dies among the bleached bones of every sailor who came before him. You must stop the ears of your companions with soft beeswax, so that none of them may hear that song. But if you yourself wish to hear it, and I suspect a man of your nature will wish exactly that, have your men bind you tightly to the mast with unbreakable rope, and instruct them, whatever you beg or command once the song takes hold of your mind, to bind you only tighter still, and not to release you until you have passed entirely beyond the sirens' island, and their voices can no longer reach you. Odysseus listened closely as she continued, describing next the narrow strait that lay beyond the sirens' shore, a passage he would need to choose his way through with the greatest care of his entire voyage, and beyond that, the sacred island of the sun god Helios, where cattle graze that must never, under any circumstance, be harmed, whatever hunger or desperation might tempt his men toward that fatal mistake. Circe spoke long into the night, and Odysseus listened to every word as a man condemned might listen to his own sentence, understanding, even as she spoke, that knowledge of the danger ahead would not necessarily be enough to prevent it. With the coming of dawn, Circe sent them on their way with a following wind, and it was not long before Odysseus, standing at the prow of his ship, saw far off across the calm water a low, grassy island where the sea itself seemed unnaturally still, and he knew at once, from Circe's careful description, that they were approaching the shore of the sirens. Friends, he called to his crew, gathering them close before the danger drew any nearer. It is not right that only one or two among us should know what Circe told me. I will tell you all, that whether we live or die, we may do so with open eyes. And he explained to them exactly what awaited, the song that could not be resisted by ordinary mortal will, and the plan Circe had given him to survive it. His men listened gravely, and set to work at once softening a store of beeswax in the sun's growing warmth until it grew pliable enough to press into each man's ears, sealing out every sound of the outside world entirely, while others bound Odysseus himself tightly to the ship's mast with stout rope, wrapping it again and again around his chest and arms until he could barely draw breath, exactly as he had instructed them. As the ship drew nearer to that low, deceptively peaceful shore, Odysseus, his ears left deliberately unstopped so that he alone might hear what no other living man had ever survived hearing, caught the first threads of a melody unlike anything he had encountered in all his years of wandering, a song of such impossible sweetness that it seemed to reach past his ears entirely and take hold of something deeper, some hidden longing he had not even known he carried. And then came the words, carried clear across the water by voices that seemed to know him, somehow, more intimately than his own memory did. "Come closer, famous Odysseus, great glory of the Achaeans," the sirens sang. "Bring your ship to rest, and listen to our voice. No man has ever sailed his dark ship past this place without staying to hear the honeyed song from our lips, and departing again with greater knowledge, for we know all the suffering the Greeks and Trojans endured at Troy by the will of the gods, and we know everything that happens upon the fertile earth." The song promised him. He confessed to the listening hall, not simply pleasure, but understanding itself, complete knowledge of every hidden thing, and it struck at the very heart of the cleverness and curiosity that had defined his whole character since boyhood, so that even bound as he was, straining every muscle against the ropes holding him fast, he found himself desperate, consumed entirely by a need to go to that shore, to sit among the singers, to learn whatever terrible price for knowledge they were offering, and he began to struggle against his bonds with a strength that surprised even himself, shouting to his men, commanding them through gestures and muffled cries to release him at once, to turn the ship toward that voice no matter the cost. But his men, their own ears sealed entirely against the song, saw only their captain thrashing wildly against his restraints, and rather than obeying his frantic signals, two of them rose from their benches and drew the ropes tighter still around his chest, exactly as he had commanded them to do before the danger arrived, while the rest bent harder still to their oars, rowing with all their strength to carry the ship past that fatal shore as quickly as possible. Only when the island had fallen well behind them, and the song had faded at last into ordinary silence, did his men dare unstop their ears and loosen the ropes binding him, finding Odysseus slumped exhausted against the mast, shaking with the passing of a longing so powerful it had very nearly cost him everything, grateful, in the end, that his own crew's obedience to his earlier command had proven stronger than his own desperate pleading. Once the siren's spell had taken hold, they had scarcely recovered from the ordeal of the siren's song when a new sound reached them across the water, the crash and roar of a sea in violent motion, and rising from the waves ahead, twin cliffs so tall their peaks vanished into cloud, with a strait so narrow between them that a man might almost believe he could throw a spear from one side to the other. Odysseus recognized the place at once from Circe's warning, and felt his stomach tighten with a dread unlike any he had faced since the Cyclops' cave, for she had told him plainly that no ship could pass this strait entirely unscathed. On one side, she had explained, beneath a cliff so sheer and smooth no man could climb it even with 20 hands and 20 feet, there lived a monster named Scylla, a creature with 12 dangling legs and 6 long necks, each ending in a head set with a triple row of close-set, deadly teeth, who dwelt hidden within a dark cave halfway up that impossible cliff, and who, when a ship passed near enough, would reach down with all 6 necks at once and snatch a man from the deck for every head she possessed, devouring them before their companions could so much as cry out a warning. On the other side of the strait, close enough that a skilled archer might shoot an arrow across the gap, grew a great fig tree overhanging a second, lower rock, beneath which lurked something even more fearsome than Scylla in its way, a creature named Charybdis, who 3 times each day swallowed down the entire sea in one great, monstrous draught, and 3 times spewed it back out again in a whirlpool violent enough to swallow any ship whole. leaving nothing behind but splintered timber. Circe told me plainly, Odysseus said, that I must choose between them, for there was no course through that strait that avoided both dangers entirely. She counseled me to steer close to Scylla's cliff rather than risk Charybdis's whirlpool, for it was better, she said, to lose 6 men to the monster's grasping heads than to lose the entire ship and every man aboard to the whirlpool's hunger. I did not tell my crew this part of her counsel. He confessed quietly to the hall, and something in his voice made clear the weight this admission still carried even now, so many years later. I could not bring myself to speak the words aloud, to tell 6 men, not knowing which 6, that they were already, in some sense, condemned before we had even entered the strait. I told them only to row with all their strength, and said nothing more. As they entered the narrow passage, the roar of Charybdis rose to a deafening pitch on one side, the sea churning and heaving as the monster drew breath to swallow the water down. Dark sand and black rock visible for a terrible moment at the very bottom of the swirling pit before the sea came rushing back with a sound like a mountain collapsing, and every man aboard stared in horror at that side of the strait, so transfixed by the whirlpool's terrible power that not one of them thought to look toward the quieter, deadlier cliff on the opposite side. It was in that single unguarded moment that Scylla struck. 6 long necks shot down from the hidden cave above, moving with a speed that gave no man aboard even the chance to cry out a warning, and 6 of Odysseus's companions, men who had survived Troy and the Cyclones and the Cyclops and the Laestrygonians and the long dark journey to the underworld itself, were snatched from the deck in an instant, lifted screaming into the air, calling out his name in desperate appeal as the monster drew them up toward her waiting cave. I have relived that moment more times than I can count. Odysseus told the silent Phaeacian court, his voice barely above a whisper now. I could see their faces, their hands outstretched toward me, and I could do nothing, nothing at all, but watch as she carried them up to the mouth of her cave and devoured them there, in plain sight of the whole crew, their cries the most pitiful sound I have heard in all my years of suffering, more terrible even than Poseidon's storm or the horror of Polyphemus's cave, because there I could act, however imperfectly, and here I could only stand at the helm, gripping the ship's timbers, and steer us onward through the strait as though nothing at all had happened, for to slow or turn back would have doomed every remaining man to Charybdis's hunger instead. They cleared the strait at last, the roar of Charybdis fading slowly behind them. But the ship that emerged into open water beyond was a quieter, grimmer vessel than the one that had entered it. Every remaining man aboard shaken by grief and by the narrow margin of their own survival. And Odysseus said that for a long while afterward, no one aboard spoke at all. Each man alone with his own private horror at what he had just witnessed. It was not long after this that they came within sight of a low, sunlit island, its meadows thick with grazing cattle and fat sheep of extraordinary beauty, their hides gleaming like polished bronze in the clear afternoon light. And Odysseus knew at once, with a dread that settled cold in his chest despite the day's warmth, that they had reached Thrinacia, sacred pasture of Helios the sun god, exactly as both Tiresias and Circe had warned him. I gathered my men before we made landfall, he told the hall, and told them plainly, holding back nothing this time, of every warning I had received concerning that island. I told them that Tiresias himself had foretold ruin for us all should any man among us so much as touch one of those sacred animals, and I begged them, for the sake of our lives and our hope of ever seeing home again, to sail past this island entirely, to press on through the night rather than risk even a single day upon its shore. His men, however, exhausted after the terrors of the strait, weary in body and spirit beyond what even the direst warning could easily overcome, begged him instead to make landfall, arguing that a night's rest upon solid ground, however dangerous the island's reputation, would serve them better than continuing to row through darkness with bodies and minds worn thin by grief and fear. Eurylochus, ever the voice of the crew's practical concerns, spoke for them all. You are iron-hearted, Odysseus, he said, never growing weary yourself, forged, it seems, from something other than flesh, while the rest of us, worn out with labor and lack of sleep, long only for solid ground beneath our feet, and a night's rest before we face whatever danger the sea still holds in store. Let us land, prepare our supper, and rest until morning, and then we will sail on again, refreshed." Odysseus, seeing the exhaustion in every face before him and recognizing the futility of forcing an unwilling and depleted crew onward against their own desperate need for rest, relented, but only after extracting from every man present a solemn oath, sworn upon the gods themselves, that none among them would touch the cattle or sheep grazing upon that shore, content instead with whatever provisions Circe had packed for them before their departure. They swore willingly enough, and made camp upon the beach, and ate what remained of their own stores, and for that first night the oath held, and no harm came to Helios's sacred herds. But the very winds themselves seemed to conspire against them after that, for no sooner had they intended to depart the following morning than a great storm rose without warning, howling down from the south and east together, tearing the sky apart with lightning, and driving such violent seas against the shore that launching the ship at all became an impossibility. Day after day the storm renewed itself with a force that seemed almost deliberate, waves crashing against the rocks with a violence that flung spray high over the tops of the cliffs, the wind shrieking through the branches of the island's few wind-bent trees, and the men, huddled together beneath whatever shelter they could find, began to whisper among themselves that some god must be holding them there on purpose, though for what reason none of them could yet say. They were forced to remain, trapped upon that island, while the storm raged on not for a single day, but for a full month without any sign of relenting, their stores of grain and wine steadily dwindling with every passing week until at last there was nothing left at all to eat but whatever fish they could catch along the rocks and whatever birds they could snare in the surrounding hills. A thin and inadequate diet that left every man gaunt and increasingly desperate as the weeks wore on. It was during this long, hungry captivity that Odysseus, driven by some restless need to seek the gods' own guidance, wandered alone one afternoon into the island's interior, away from his starving companions, to pray for some sign of how they might yet escape their situation, and it was there, exhausted by hunger and worry, that he fell into a deep sleep, leaving his men alone upon the shore with nothing to eat and the sacred cattle grazing, tantalizingly, within easy reach. It was Eurylochus who spoke the words that would doom them all. "Comrades," he said to the assembled, starving crew, "every death is hateful to wretched mortals, but none is more pitiful than death by hunger, wasting slowly away with nothing left to eat. Let us drive off the best of these cattle here and sacrifice them to the immortal gods, and if ever we reach Ithaca, our own native land, we will build at once a rich temple to Helios and fill it with fine offerings in recompense. But if he is angered over his straight-horned cattle and wishes to destroy our ship, and the other gods agree with him, I for one would rather die at once with a mouthful of the sea than waste away slowly on this desolate island." The starving men, hearing this argument that so conveniently matched their own desperate hunger, needed little further persuasion. They drove off the finest of the cattle grazing nearby, and since they had no barley for the proper ritual, they used what oak leaves they could gather in its place, and prayed to the gods even as they slaughtered the animals, flayed them, and set the choicest portions roasting over their fires, the smell of meat filling the air for the first time in weeks, an aroma of relief and satisfaction that nonetheless carried within it, unseen by any of them, the seed of their complete destruction. Odysseus woke from his sleep to that same smell of roasting meat carried on the wind, and felt his heart sink even before he had fully understood what he was smelling, for he knew, with a dread certainty, exactly what his hungry, desperate men must have done in his absence. "I cried aloud to the gods when I understood," he told the hushed hall, "though I already knew, even as I prayed, that no prayer of mine could undo what had already been done." And it was not long before Helios himself, whose cattle these were, learned of the crime committed against him, and went at once to Zeus, demanding justice. "Father Zeus, and all you other blessed gods who live forever," Helios is said to have declared before the assembled council of Olympus, his voice burning with an anger to match his own fire. "Punish now the companions of Odysseus, son of Laertes, for they have insolently killed my cattle, cattle in which I always took delight, whenever I climbed the starry heavens, and whenever I turned back again toward earth. If they do not pay me fitting recompense for my cattle, I will go down and shine instead among the dead, and give my light to them alone, refusing the earth and every living man upon it my light forever. Zeus, understanding the gravity of a threat that would plunge the entire world into permanent darkness, answered at once that he would see the offense punished. And it was not long after Odysseus's men had finally succeeded in launching their ship, once the storm at last relented, sailing out at last from that cursed shore with full stomachs and hearts still troubled by what they had done, that the sky itself darkened without warning above their vessel, a black cloud settling directly over the ship, though the sea around them remained, for the moment, strangely calm. The wind struck first, Odysseus said, tearing our sail to shreds and snapping both forestays at once. And then, before any man among us could so much as reach for an oar, Zeus's thunderbolt struck the ship directly amidships, splitting the whole vessel apart with a crack of sound and light that I can still hear, even now, whenever I close my eyes to sleep. Every man was cast into the sea at once, and I watched, from the water myself, as my companions, one after another, were swept beneath the waves and did not rise again, denied even the mercy of a quick death, robbed instead of any homecoming at all, their bones scattered now upon a seafloor no one living will ever find, their names remembered only in whatever fragments of this story survive to be told. Odysseus himself survived only because the mast and keel of the shattered ship remained lashed together by a scrap of oxhide rope, and clinging to this makeshift raft, tossed helplessly upon a sea now whipped again into fury by a contrary wind, he found himself carried back, to his horror, along the very course he had just escaped, back toward the narrow strait, where Scylla and Charybdis waited still. All that night I was carried along, he told the hall, and at dawn I came again to the very strait I had so recently passed with 6 of my men still living, and I heard, from a distance, the terrible roar of Charybdis drawing breath to swallow the sea once more, and I understood, in that instant, that I was being carried directly into her hungry mouth with no oar, no crew, and no strength left to fight the current. At the very last moment, as the whirlpool began drawing his makeshift raft down into its churning throat, Odysseus caught sight of the great fig tree overhanging the rocks above, and leaping upward with a strength born purely of desperation, he caught hold of its branches and clung there, suspended above the abyss like a bat clinging to the underside of a cave roof, watching helplessly as Charybdis swallowed his mast and keeled down into her depths, the very raft that had carried him this far, vanishing entirely into that dark, roaring throat. For what felt an eternity, he hung there, arms burning with the effort of holding on, waiting for the whirlpool to spew back what it had swallowed, and when at last, after a wait that seemed to stretch on longer than any single night of his whole voyage, the mast and keel came bursting back up to the surface amid a great column of foam, Odysseus let himself drop from the branches directly onto the floating wreckage, paddling with his hands and feet to carry himself clear of the strait before the whirlpool could draw breath a second time. For 9 days after that he drifted alone upon the open sea, clinging to that same broken wreckage, with no food, no fresh water, and no companion left alive to share his suffering or ease his fear, the sun burning down upon him by day and the cold sea chilling him through by night, until on the 10th day, exhausted nearly past the point of caring whether he lived or died, the current carried him at last to a small, solitary shore, thick with cypress and alder, ringed by flowering meadows he recognized, with a despair he could barely put into words, as belonging to no ordinary island at all. It was Ogygia, he said quietly to the hall, and something in his voice made clear that this part of the story, though the Phaeacians before him had not yet heard the full account of it, was one he had already lived through once in memory, alone, for 7 long years. Calypso found me there, more dead than alive, and took me into her cave, and nursed me back from the very edge of death, and it is there that I remained, against my own will, though never through any cruelty of hers, for 7 years, while she loved me, and cared for me, and even offered me a gift no mortal man is often given, a life without end, without age, without the death that comes for every other man born of woman. If only I would remain forever at her side, and forget entirely the life I had left behind. He did not linger long over those 7 years in the retelling, for the Phaeacian court, he knew, had already witnessed the very end of that captivity with their own eyes, when he had washed ashore, broken and alone, upon their own coast only days before. "I will say only this," he told them, "that no comfort she offered me, however genuine her love, however beautiful her island, ever once eased the ache of knowing that my wife waited still in Ithaca, not knowing whether I lived or died, and that my son had grown to manhood without ever once looking upon his father's face. There were evenings when I could recall Penelope's voice so clearly it seemed she stood beside me on that foreign shore, and mornings when I woke uncertain whether I had dreamed of my own home or simply remembered it, the two states blurring together after so many years until I could no longer always tell which was which. I wept upon that shore every single day of those 7 years, not from ingratitude, but because a man's heart, however well cared for, cannot make a home of a place that is not his own, and cannot love a stranger's kindness so completely that it forgets the ordinary, imperfect love waiting for him across the sea. It was Athena's own pleading before Zeus, he explained, briefly, for the hall already understood this part as well, that had finally won his release, and Hermes' descent to command Calypso to let him go, and the raft he had built with his own hands, and Poseidon's storm that had so nearly killed him even after his release, and the 2 days and nights of swimming that had finally brought him to this very shore, to this very hall, to the kindness of this very king and queen who had fed him and clothed him and listened, now, to the whole terrible, wondrous account of everything that had happened to him since he last stood upon the smoking ruins of Troy. Odysseus fell silent then, and for a long moment, no one within that great firelit hall spoke a single word, the whole assembled court of Phaeacians sitting motionless in the spell of everything they had just heard, until at last King Alcinous rose from his seat, his face solemn with the particular respect owed to a man who had endured so much and survived to tell of it. "Odysseus," he said, "you have suffered greatly, and yet you have told your tale with such grace and clarity that it has passed among us like the finest song of any bard, and I do not doubt a single word of it, unlikely though so much of it might sound to lesser ears. You shall not leave this hall as you arrived, a nameless stranger cast up naked upon our shore. We will see you home to Ithaca ourselves, aboard one of our own swift ships, and every man among my nobles shall bring a gift worthy of your suffering, that you might arrive at your own hearth not as a beggar, but as a king returning in the honor that has always been rightfully yours." The nobles gathered in that hall murmured their agreement, and over the following day, gifts were brought and loaded, bronze tripods and cauldrons of fine workmanship, cloaks and tunics woven with skill no other kingdom could match, gold enough to ease whatever hardships still awaited him at home, until the hold of the promised ship groaned under the weight of Phaeacian generosity. Queen Arete herself oversaw the careful packing of these treasures, ensuring that each gift was stowed secure, where no thief or careless sailor might disturb it during the crossing, and Nausicaa, the young princess whose kindness upon the riverbank had begun this whole final chapter of his journey, came to bid him farewell with words that Odysseus said he would carry with him for the rest of his days. "Farewell, stranger," she told him, "and when you are home again in your own country, remember me sometimes, for it is to me, before any other, that you owe your life." Odysseus answered her with all the warmth and gratitude he could put into words, promising that he would honor her always as one might honor a goddess, for it was indeed her courage and her kindness, more than any other single act along his entire journey, that had opened the door to his eventual homecoming. That evening, a final feast was held in his honor, and Demodocus sang once more, though this time Odysseus listened without the same crushing grief that had marked his earlier evenings in that hall, for he understood now that his long ordeal was very nearly at its end. When the feast concluded, he boarded the ship the Phaeacians had prepared for him, and it is said that no sooner had he lain down upon the deck, exhausted after the telling of so long and painful a story, than a deep and dreamless sleep fell over him, deeper than any sleep he had known even during his years of captivity, a sleep so profound and complete that he remained entirely unaware of the swift and magical crossing that followed, the Phaeacian sailors rowing with a skill and speed that no ordinary vessel could match, cutting through the night, and the sea itself as surely and as swiftly as a hawk cutting through open air, faster than any bird, carrying him steadily homeward while he slept on, undisturbed, dreaming, perhaps, of the very shore that was even now rising up to meet him at last. When the ship reached the harbor of Ithaca, deep in the stillness before dawn, the sailors did not wake him, but carried him gently from the ship still wrapped in his sleep, laying him upon the sand beneath the shelter of an old and sacred olive tree, and setting beside him, in careful order, every one of the treasures Alcinous had given him, before turning their ship back out to sea and rowing away into the darkness. Their duty to their unexpected guest complete at last, dawn broke slowly over that shore, gray lights spreading gradually across a sea grown calm and quiet after so many years of storm and violence. And when Odysseus at last woke from his long, deep sleep, he found himself entirely disoriented, uncertain even of where he had landed, for a thick mist, sent deliberately by Athena to conceal his presence until she herself could arrange a proper meeting with him, hung low over the whole shore, blurring the shapes of hills and trees he might otherwise have recognized at once. He rose unsteadily to his feet, looked about him at a landscape rendered strange and unfamiliar by that concealing mist, and felt a despair unlike almost any he had experienced throughout his entire journey take hold of him. For after 20 years of longing, after storms and monsters and the loss of every companion who had sailed with him, he did not, in this first disorienting moment, even recognize his own home. "Ah, what land have I come to now?" he said aloud to the empty shore, his voice carrying a bitterness that had been building through the whole of his long ordeal. "And what people live here? Are they savage and lawless and violent? Or do they welcome strangers and fear the gods in their hearts? Have the Phaeacians deceived me after all, leaving me upon some unknown coast, instead of carrying me home, as they promised?" It was into this moment of despair and confusion that Athena chose, at last, to reveal herself, though not in her full immortal glory, but disguised first as a young shepherd, well-dressed and delicate in appearance, the sort of figure one might expect to encounter tending flocks upon a prosperous island. She approached him directly, and Odysseus, ever cautious even in his disorientation, greeted her with careful courtesy, asking her to tell him what land he had come to, for he did not recognize it at all. "You must be a stranger indeed, or come from very far away," the disguised goddess answered, "not to know the name of this land, for it is not so obscure as you seem to believe. Many people know of it, both those who dwell toward the dawn and the sun, and those who live behind us, toward the misty dark. It is a rugged place, no fine country for driving horses, yet not entirely poor either, though it is narrow. It grows abundant grain, and bears wine as well, for the rain never fails it, and the dew falls generous upon it. And it is good land for goats and for cattle alike, and every kind of timber grows upon it. And it has watering places that never run dry throughout the year. This land, stranger, is called Ithaca, even as far away as Troy, which I am told lies a considerable distance from our Achaean shores." At the sound of that name, Odysseus felt joy surge up through him so suddenly and so completely that it very nearly overwhelmed him. And yet, even in that first flooding rush of relief, some deep and long-practiced instinct for caution held him back from revealing his own identity too readily, even to this seemingly ordinary shepherd. And so he answered instead with a carefully constructed false history, claiming to be a Cretan exile fleeing a blood debt, a story spun with such fluent and convincing detail that it might have deceived any ordinary listener entirely. Athena, hearing this elaborate fabrication, could not help but smile, and it was at this moment, at last, that she cast aside her disguise entirely, revealing herself in her true form, a tall and radiant woman whose beauty carried within it an unmistakable, unearthly power, and she reached out and touched his cheek with what seemed, to Odysseus, a mixture of genuine affection and amused exasperation both at once. "It would take a great trickster indeed, and a thief besides, to outmatch you in all your various deceits," she told him, laughing. "Even a god might struggle to outdo you in cunning. Stubborn man, master of every kind of cunning device, are you never to stop your tricks and your lying stories, even here, in your own native land? You did not even recognize me, Pallas Athena, daughter of Zeus, who has always stood beside you through every hardship and guarded you, and made you loved among the Phaeacians as you were. Odysseus, overwhelmed now by both joy and a certain sheepish embarrassment at having attempted to deceive the very goddess who had guided and protected him through the whole of his long ordeal, fell to his knees and embraced her, weeping openly at last. The mist Athena had raised around them lifting at that very moment to reveal, in clear and unmistakable morning light, the true shape of the island he had spent 20 years longing to see again, the harbor where his own ships had once launched. For Troy, the hills he had hunted as a young man, the very shore of his own home stretching out before him after 2 decades of storm and grief and wandering. "Goddess," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no effort now to hide. "Forgive my caution, for I have learned, through bitter years of suffering, to trust almost nothing that presents itself easily before me. But tell me now, truly, is this truly my own beloved Ithaca?" "It is," Athena told him, "and now you must listen carefully, for your troubles are not yet fully behind you. Your own hall is filled even now with arrogant men who have consumed your household's wealth for years, believing you dead, and pressing your faithful wife toward a marriage she has delayed through every clever means available to her, though her patience and her cleverness both are very nearly exhausted. You cannot simply walk into your own halls and reclaim your throne by open force. Not yet. Not until you have learned exactly how matters stand within your own house and gathered what allies remain loyal to you. And so I will disguise you now, that you might move unseen and unknown among your own people and learn the truth of things before you act." With that, she touched him with her staff, and Odysseus felt his own body transform beneath her power, his skin withering into the wrinkled leather of extreme old age, his hair falling away to a few thin gray wisps, his strong limbs shrinking and weakening until he stood before her not as a king in the full vigor of his strength, but as a bent and ragged old beggar, dressed in filthy, tattered cloth. A figure any man might pass on the road without a second glance. Exactly the disguise, Athena assured him, that would let him move safely and invisibly through his own kingdom while he gathered the knowledge and the allies he would need before revealing himself at last. "Go first," she instructed him, "to the hut of your swineherd, Eumaeus, who has remained faithful to you and to your household through all these years of your absence, tending your pigs upon the far hillside, and keeping his loyalty to you when so many others have abandoned all hope of your return. He will shelter you and feed you and tell you truly how things stand in your own house, for he does not know it is you he speaks to, and will therefore hide nothing from a stranger's ears. I myself will go, meanwhile, to fetch your son Telemachus home from Sparta, for it is time, at long last, that father and son stood together to face what remains ahead of you both." And so it was that Odysseus, in the shape of a broken old beggar, made his way alone across the hills of his own kingdom, unrecognized by the very land he had spent 20 years longing to see, toward the modest hut of the one servant whose loyalty had never once wavered through all the long years of his absence. He found Eumaeus exactly where Athena had said he would be, seated outside a well-built enclosure of piled stone, surrounded by a dozen sties holding hundreds of swine, a rough but sturdy dwelling that spoke of careful, devoted labor over many years, and the swineherd, seeing a ragged stranger approaching, rose at once, not with suspicion, but with an instinctive and immediate hospitality that struck Odysseus, even disguised as he was, with a fresh wave of emotion, for here, in this humble hut, was exactly the sacred welcome his own household had once been famous for, before the suitors had trampled every custom of decency beneath their own greed. "Come in, old friend," Eumaeus said, waving off the dogs that had begun barking and circling the disguised king, "before these hounds tear you apart. Though truly, I have little enough to offer you beyond a place to sit and whatever poor fare my own table can provide. My heart still grieves, even now, for a master I served since boyhood, a man I loved as I have loved no other, and who I fear is lost to us forever, wandering dead upon some foreign shore, denied even a proper burial by kin who might otherwise honor his memory." Odysseus, hearing his own faithful servant speak of him with such unguarded grief, found it almost unbearably difficult to maintain his disguise. But he held his tongue and allowed Eumaeus to lead him inside, to seat him upon a pile of brushwood and goatskins near the fire, and to serve him a meal of roasted meat, apologizing all the while that the finest of the herd were reserved, against his own wishes, for the insolent suitors who had taken over his master's hall. They devour everything without a thought for tomorrow, Eumaeus said bitterly, tearing bread and passing it to his guest, consuming my master's wealth as though it were their own inheritance, wooing his wife with a shamelessness that would make any decent man's blood boil, and I can do nothing but watch, and serve, and wait for a homecoming I fear will never come, though my heart refuses even now to give up every last hope entirely. Odysseus, testing the loyalty of this humble servant even as his heart ached to reveal himself, asked carefully whether Eumaeus believed his master might yet return, and the swineherd's answer, given without any suspicion that he spoke to the very man he mourned, moved Odysseus more deeply than almost anything else he had encountered since first setting foot again upon his own soil. Many wanderers have come through here, claiming news of Odysseus, Eumaeus said, shaking his head, each one hoping for a reward for whatever comforting lie they might offer my mistress, and I have learned, through bitter experience, to trust none of them, however convincing their tales. But you, stranger, you have an honest face, whatever else the years have done to you, and though I dare not hope too openly, for hope too often deceived brings only fresh grief when it fails yet again, I confess some small part of me still watches the horizon each evening, waiting. They spoke long into that evening, the disguised king and his faithful servant, Eumaeus recounting the full extent of the suitors' arrogance, the toll their occupation had taken upon a household once famous for its order and its honor, describing how his mistress Penelope had grown thin and pale with years of sleepless grief, how young Telemachus had been forced to grow into manhood far too quickly, surrounded by men who mocked him openly in his own hall, and how he himself, old and increasingly weary, had begun to fear he would not live to see whatever ending this long, sorrowful waiting was destined to reach. Odysseus listened to every word with a grief and a fury he was forced, again and again, to conceal behind the weathered face of an old beggar, understanding now, more clearly than ever, exactly what awaited him once he finally chose to reveal himself within his own hall. It was on the following day, while Odysseus still sat disguised beside Eumaeus' fire, that Athena, true to her word, guided Telemachus safely home from Sparta, warning him through a vision as he prepared to depart that the suitors, growing ever more desperate and reckless in their pursuit of Penelope's hand, had by now plotted an ambush against him upon the sea, hoping to murder the young prince before he could return and interfere further with their designs upon his household. Guided by Athena's counsel, Telemachus avoided the ambush entirely, landing instead upon a distant part of the island and making his way overland, sending his ship and its crew on ahead to the main harbor, while he himself set out on foot toward the very hut where his father now sat waiting, though neither of them yet knew the other was so near. When Telemachus arrived at last at the swineherd's hut, the same dogs that had greeted the disguised Odysseus with such fierce barking now bounded forward instead with whimpering, tail-wagging joy, recognizing at once a master they had known since childhood, and Eumaeus, seeing the young prince approach, rushed out to embrace him with a relief so overwhelming that he wept openly, kissing his head and both his eyes and hands, exactly as a father might greet a son believed lost and now unexpectedly restored. "You have come home, Telemachus, sweet light of my eyes," the old swineherd said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I feared I would never see you again, once you had sailed for Pylos. Come in, and let me look at you properly, for it has been too long since you graced this humble hut with your presence, you who so rarely leave the palace now to visit us who tend your father's herds." Telemachus, moved by this unguarded affection, returned the old man's embrace warmly, and together they entered the hut, where the disguised Odysseus rose from his seat by the fire, offering it to the young prince as any polite stranger might do in the presence of nobility. Telemachus, however, embarrassed at the thought of displacing an elderly guest from his seat, insisted the stranger remain seated, and had Eumaeus arrange fresh brushwood and a fleece for himself instead, a small but telling gesture of the same natural courtesy and consideration that had once marked his father's own character, in which Odysseus, watching his son from behind the disguise of an old beggar's weathered face, noted with a swelling pride he could scarcely contain. They ate together, the three of them, and Telemachus questioned the disguised stranger politely about his origins, listening with evident sympathy to the same fabricated history of Cretan exile that Odysseus had woven for Athena the day before turning to Eumaeus and asking him to send word to the palace that he had returned safely, so that his mother's anxious waiting might finally be relieved, and instructing the swineherd to make certain the message reached her privately, without alerting any of the suitors gathered still within his own hall to his safe arrival. Once Eumaeus had departed on this errand, leaving father and son alone together within the hut for the first time since Telemachus was still an infant too young to remember his father's face. Athena chose this moment, at last, to work her final transformation. She appeared briefly at the doorway, visible only to Odysseus and to the dogs, who whimpered and shrank away rather than barking at her divine presence. And with a touch of her golden staff, she restored Odysseus entirely to his true form, his beggar's rags becoming once more the fine clothing the Phaeacians had given him, his withered, aged skin filling out again with the strength and vigor of a man in the very prime of his life, his shoulders broadening, his whole bearing transformed in an instant from bent and ragged poverty into the unmistakable presence of a king. Telemachus, watching this sudden and inexplicable transformation take place before his very eyes, recoiled in astonishment and, for one brief, superstitious moment, genuine fear, believing that he stood suddenly in the presence of some god who had chosen, for reasons of his own, to reveal his true divine nature within this humble swineherd's hut. "You are changed, stranger," Telemachus said, his voice unsteady. "You were an old man only a moment ago, and now you appear entirely different, wearing different clothes, your very skin transformed. Surely you must be one of the gods who rule the wide heaven above us. Be gracious to us, then, and we will offer you whatever pleasing sacrifice we can, and gifts of finely wrought gold. Only spare us, I beg you." Odysseus, his heart aching at the sight of his own son's fear, and at the strange, bittersweet realization that even now, standing before him at last after 20 long years, Telemachus did not yet recognize his own father, answered gently, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hold entirely in check. "I am no god," he said. "Why do you liken me to the immortals? I am your father, Telemachus, the very man for whose sake you have grieved and suffered so many hardships, enduring the arrogance and violence of other men in my long absence." And with those words, he could contain himself no longer, and wept, tears he had held back through 20 years of war and wandering and loss finally spilling freely down his face. Tears such as he had not shed even at the height of his suffering upon Calypso's lonely island. And he crossed the small space of that humble hut and embraced his son at last. Telemachus, still struggling to comprehend what he was being told, could not at first bring himself to believe it, so many years of grief and uncertainty having taught him, perhaps, to guard too carefully against a hope that might yet prove false. "You cannot be my father," he said, his voice trembling between hope and disbelief. "You cannot be Odysseus, for some god is surely deceiving me, weaving some cruel illusion to increase my grief and my longing even further, for no mortal man could change his shape so swiftly and so completely, from bent old age to vigorous strength, within the span of a single moment." "Telemachus," Odysseus answered, holding his son now by the shoulders and looking directly into eyes that so closely mirrored his own, "it is not fitting that you should marvel so greatly, or disbelieve so completely, at your own father's presence before you. No other Odysseus will ever come to you. I am he, the very man who suffered so much and wandered so far, and who has come home now, in the 20th year, to my own native land at last. This transformation you witnessed was the work of Athena, the bright-eyed goddess who watches over me, and who has the power to make me appear as she wishes, sometimes like a beggar, sometimes like a young man in fine clothing. For it is an easy thing for the gods who hold the wide heaven to glorify a mortal man, or bring him low. exactly as it pleases them to do. At these words, at last, the last of Telemachus's disbelief broke apart entirely, and father and son fell into one another's arms, weeping together with a grief and a joy so tightly intertwined that neither could easily be separated from the other. Their cries, Odysseus said, rising as piercingly as the cries of eagles or vultures robbed of their young. 20 years of separation, of longing, of uncertainty and fear and hope deferred again and again, pouring out at once in that small, humble hut, far from any palace, far from any throne, in the one place on the whole island where a father and a son, finally reunited, could weep together without fear of being seen. When at last their tears had run their course, and the two men sat together beside the fire, father and son in truth now as much as in blood, Odysseus began to speak of what still lay ahead of them, and it was here, in the quiet aftermath of that overwhelming reunion, that the full weight of their situation settled over both of them at once. We cannot simply walk into our own hall and reclaim what is ours, Odysseus told his son, his voice steady now, the voice of a king and a strategist once more rather than a weeping father. There are more than 100 men occupying our house, Telemachus, arrogant and armed, and only the two of us, however determined, to stand against them. We must be as clever now as we were once brave at Troy, and gather what allies we can trust completely, and choose the exact moment of our striking with the same care I once gave to the trick that finally brought down the walls of that city. Telemachus, still catching his breath from the overwhelming emotion of the past hour, looked at his father now not simply with the love of a son long deprived of his parent, but with something new as well, a dawning recognition that he was, for the first time in his life, being trusted as a partner in a task that would require every ounce of courage and cunning he had spent these past months of searching and growing quietly cultivating within himself. "Tell me what must be done," he said, "and I will do it, whatever the risk, for I have waited too long for this day to hesitate now that it has finally come." Odysseus studied his son's face for a long moment in the firelight, searching, perhaps, for some final trace of the fatherless boy he had left as an infant, and finding instead, to his quiet satisfaction, the steady bearing of a young man who had grown, in his father's absence, into someone worth standing beside. "You will return to the palace ahead of me," he told him, "and say nothing of what has passed here today, not even to your mother, for the fewer who know of my return, the safer we both remain until the moment is right. I will follow after, still disguised as I am now, and present myself at our own hall as nothing more than a wandering beggar seeking a night's shelter, that I might watch these men who have plagued our household with my own eyes, and judge for myself which among them might yet be reasoned with, and which must simply be destroyed." And so, as the fire burned low within that humble swineherd's hut, father and son bent their heads together in quiet, urgent conversation, beginning at last to shape the plan that would decide the fate of their entire household. Two men against more than 100, bound together now not only by blood, but by a shared and unshakable resolve, while outside, unaware that the king they believed dead had at last returned to his own shores. The suitors continued there, feasting in his hall, their days of arrogant safety, though they did not yet know it, numbered at last.